The growth has definitely turned a little bit the last month, and I think the key part of that is it's just gotten more broad.
We're not seeing a weakening, we're not seeing a contraction, but this is what drives the economy, and we are seeing a deceleration.
What we're seeing is signs that the consumer is slowing down.
When you look at last quarter's GDP, a little bit lower, a little bit below trend, I think this means we are going to start to see more slowing in GDP and overall spending.
There are key pockets of weakness. This is a lopsided economy.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Live from New York City this morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide. Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now. Coming into Tuesday on a 5-day winning streak on the S&P 500. 35 all-time highs on the S&P so far in 2024. Chairman Powell taking center stage down in Washington, D.C. A little bit later on this morning. It is day one of his 2-day testimony.
At a time where people are wondering where the threshold, where the balance of risks is for him, I wonder how much the Fed has left the room. I wonder how much the market is moving ahead of the Fed, because whether they cut or whether they don't cut, how much is that the important message versus the actual weakening in the economy versus ongoing resilience? That, to me, at this point for markets, is the real question.
Are we being too cute by thinking about this? Will it be about the economy and not about President Biden and his leadership? Because it's a double-header today. It's not just the likes of Chairman Powell, it's Secretary Yellen on Capitol Hill as well.
That's right, and she's going to be the one that probably gets more questions about potentially the deterioration in the president's health that was on display at the debate. And the questions now are swirling, even from Democrats within the party, about whether or not he should step aside. Biden was out full front yesterday, defiant, digging in his heels. He did a call-in on Morning Joe. He wrote a letter to congressional Democrats. He got on the phone with the donors. And then at night, he had the Congressional Black Caucus held a meeting with them. He is shoring up the Democratic Party that at this point in a campaign should be firmly behind him.
Well, and whether he is shoring it up will be the key question. And we can analyze Defiant Joe and for the rest of the show. But just to put these two ideas together, the idea of the Federal Reserve and how it responds to some of this political pressure. Peter Tchir coming on the show later today saying, I physically wince at the thought of the first rate cut in September, stocks soaring 5% and literally all hell breaking loose on social media as it is portrayed as helping the incumbents. How that political risk really calls into question the likelihood of a September rate cut.
We can sit on the economy just for one beat longer. We might as well.
Thank you.
That's what we're here for. Chairman Powell last week said something quite interesting. This was the quote. Because the U.S. economy is strong and the labour market is strong, we have the ability to take our time and get this right. And then we got some jobs data. A little bit later in the week, we had an ISM services print. I just wonder how much time he thinks they actually have, how strong he thinks this labour market is. And I think the update, that assessment today is probably going to be the important one.
100%. Do you think he's going to give it?
I think he's got to.
Well, here's the issue. If he says the exact same thing, my question is, do you think that people are going to believe him? Or basically, is he trying to keep all options on the table for things to move aside? The reason why I ask that question is because I would love it if he comes out and he says the balance is shifting. The issue is he hasn't wanted to say anything conclusive whatsoever. Whether he can help himself, I guess, is the key question.
And when it comes to Jay Powell, it is going to be highly political. This is what Rep. Andy Barr had to say, telling reporters yesterday evening. I want Powell to reiterate that the Fed's monetary policy trajectory is going to be data dependent and not political. And he was talking about this September rate hike, this whole debate the market is having. What Rep. Barr is saying, and he's the House Financial Services, he's on the committee, he said, quote, it will not be perceived as apolitical. It's gotten very tense in terms of whether or not the Fed cuts in September. It's becoming more intense on Capitol Hill if that's going to be seen political, given the dire straits the president's in.
Chairman Powell just around the corner. Let's start with equity futures and the scores this morning. Equity futures on the S&P 500 positive by 0.2%. Make it day 6, and we will equal the longest winning streak, daily winning streak of the year so far in the S&P 500. In the bond market, just about unchanged on 10s, 428.42. Lisa focused on one thing, tons of supply coming out a little bit later.
Yeah, we're going to have a 3-year auction today. We've got later this week, we've got 10 years and 30 years. A question I'm going to have is how much do you see some of the fears that we saw previously giving sort of a floor to how much longer term treasuries can rally? Do we see that floor start to ebb away and actually demand coming back as growth concerns, to your point earlier, really come back to the fore?
Yields just about unchanged on a 10-year. This is the lineup this morning. For the next hour or so, we'll catch up with Goncalves of MUFG, with US stocks reaching fresh record highs. Bianchi of Evercore as President Joe Biden refuses to end his campaign. And Kelsey Berro of JPMorgan saying risks are rising for the labour market. We begin with our top story, the S&P 500 reaching its 35th record high of the year. Goncalves of MUFG says now comes the hard part. US markets, especially a narrow set of stocks in the equity space, have moved from pricing in perfection to the euphoria phase of the risk bubble. Eventually, there will be an exhaustion point that sees assets return back to earth. George joins us around the table. So, George, good morning, first of all.
Good morning.
And second of all, the first question. You're expecting a difficult second half. What's bringing that about?
Well, the first half itself has been proven to be much softer and weaker and has been decelerating all throughout the last few weeks, few months. And I think that that's setting up the stage for a really challenging summer and into the fall. We have this very highly contentious election to go through. And think about like the setup that we're coming in at the highs for risk markets. We have earnings season ahead of us. And we have the kind of the doldrums of summer, right? We have a few key macro event weeks. We have this week, we have the end of this month, and then we have Jackson Hole. In between that time period, there's very low conviction in the market. Look at the way the VIX is. Like that's setting up for an environment of difficulty when we get into the throes of the election, number one. And number two, which corporates are going to be really embarking on new R&D projects, capital projects? They borrowed all this money at the beginning of the year. They've done their hiring, probably overhired in my opinion. And so now we're into the phase where there might be a pullback on actual hiring and maybe layoffs into the second half. And that will contract growth.
Neil Dancer of Renmax said the cost of doing nothing is going up. It sounds like you agree.
Look, I think that the Fed should be easing. That's been my position for such a long time, that they should have been easing and being preemptive, but they're dragging their feet because they want to get the confidence on inflation. They might get it this week if we get a big catch-up on shelter inflation. But nonetheless, it's going to be hard for the Fed to change their message until at least Jackson Hole, I think. And by then it might be too late. And the September cut really comes down to 25 basis points or 50. Remember, first cuts have been historically large when the Fed has actually made a policy mistake. And I think that they're in that potential window where they're actually creating a policy mistake the longer they wait.
This is the key question. What does too late mean? What is at stake? What kind of consequence could there be if they don't cut, as you believe they should, this month?
Well, so look, this month is going to be the path towards a July cut. And listen, I was one of the last holdouts on having a July cut as our base case, and we moved it after the hawkish rhetoric and the May NFP, which has been proven to have been revised lower. But nonetheless, I mean, it'll take a lot for the Fed to set us up for a July cut. It's not impossible, but it's really going to be setting us up for September, which takes us throughout the whole summer. And this can drag out. And as we're waiting, that uncertainty with markets at the highs, again, markets don't have to stay at the highs. I mean, I know we were running on 35, maybe 36 days of all-time highs, but it's been a grind, right? It's been a grind. It's been an unloved kind of like, hey, yes, markets keep going higher. Any sort of pullback in equities through September, the Fed can be much more aggressive.
When you said unloved, there's sort of a real kind of tension right now. Unloved versus euphoria, unloved versus bubble. So which is it? At a time where you have Citigroup saying it's time to book profits on AI high flyers, you've got Bank of America coming out talking about the fragility of tech stocks simply because of the huge swings that you're seeing on any kind of day-to-day volatility. How do you sort of understand euphoria with this sort of very uncomfortable rally that you see going on?
Yeah, I mean, look, so obviously these concentrated moves and these handful of names have really masked everything. But everyone looks at the indices. They don't just look at individual names. And the fact that equities are up so massively up until the middle of the year, that gives you that kind of confidence that maybe there's financial conditions easing. But we haven't really seen that pick up in sort of retail spending. And we haven't seen the translation of financial conditions translating into broader growth. So it's euphoria to the point where it's not. So the question that I think most people really ask me is, if we see like a retracement in tech stocks of 10, 20, 30%, will that change? Will that be much more damaging than the rally itself, right? So we've had a massive rally in all of these handful of names. Did that result in financial conditions easing, or was it too concentrated to not matter? And therefore, if they pull back and they bring the whole indices down, you'll focus on the indices more than the individual names. So it's kind of like this kind of a mixed sort of a performance message, but nonetheless, if we were to see those stocks no longer go up and actually pull back, then you can get an environment where people focus on the indices, not the individual names, and say, oh, it's just because of these handful of names that they pulled back.
Are you saying that basically if you do see a 10% pullback, that Fed Chair Jay Powell has the green light to cut rates?
I think he has the green light to cut rates given the sort of data that we're getting on the jobs front. We've been getting it for the last 2-3 months. And it continues to be mixed, continues to get revised lower. And I think it's going to get worse from here on out until September. So I think that the hiring plans, as I said earlier, are going to stall. And you're going to get into that tough environment before the election. So, I mean, I don't think that this idea that the Fed's being political is true. They're going to do what's right for the economy. And if that requires a larger cut to start off the process, they'll do it.
But right now, the President of the United States, who's the presumptive nominee, is in a very vulnerable position. Doesn't this make September that much harder for this Fed?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that, in fact, actually going and doing what's right for the economy proves that they are obviously not being driven by the political sort of winds. So I think that this idea that they have to hold off until November, until after the election, then you're really ensuring a much more, not a harder landing, but your chances of soft landing really decrease the longer you wait.
Can we get some trades from you? What are we looking for? Bull flattening, wider spreads, credit? What are you looking to do in treasuries?
So this is the challenge. We've had the inverted curve for over now 2 years running, roughly, on the 2s10s curve. It's been the most difficult trade to maintain, but the curve trade is the right trade because ultimately, if the Fed can fix this really quickly, they can go much faster than what's priced into the forward curve. And so we do think that the curve steepener is the right trade. And as we're waiting and we get into this period of realizing that earnings are not going to be that robust and that the Fed ultimately will be like a bridge loan between now and the next administration, whichever one that is. So if the Fed's the bridge loan, they have to cut at least 100, 150. And then we'll see what sort of policy measures get implemented by either, whoever wins, right?
I'm just listening to the words you're using. They could, they should, they have to. Will?
Well, the will come when they start realizing the revisions become much more dominant. We get into the September, October time period, and we realize that the economy has decelerated, and they'll be completely agnostic to the political backdrop. They're going to be focused on, we don't want to have this thing unravel.
George Goncalves, good to see you, of MUFG. Great to catch up. Looking ahead to Chairman Powell Day 1, another name on a long list of names that have joined this programme saying they should, they have to, will they do something soon?
That's the reason why it'll be interesting to see whether the balance of risks has shifted more materially for Fed Chair Jay Powell. That said, right now, priced into the futures markets, doesn't look like they will. Certainly not in July.
Equity futures this morning, just a little bit positive. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. United Airlines says another of its Boeing aircrafts has lost a main landing gear wheel while taking off Monday from L.A. No one was injured on the flight, which went on to land safely in Denver. The incident is similar to one aboard a United flight in March, which helped trigger a federal safety review of the carrier. Nike is bringing back a retired executive to try to revive its slumping sales. According to a memo obtained by Bloomberg, 30-year veteran executive Tom Petty is returning as Nike's vice president of marketplace partners. He left the sportswear giant back in 2020. Nike is trying to rebuild relationships with retailers like Foot Locker after pulling products from many stores in favor of its own shops, e-commerce, and apps. The company's stock has declined 33% this year through Monday, with sales continuing to fall. And after 134 days of pre-celebrations, Arnott Ambani, the youngest son of Asia's richest person, is set to tie the knot this week. Celebrations began in March, and they featured performances by Rihanna, visits to the family's personal zoo, and a luxury cruise from Palmero to Portofino in May. The family had also held a mass wedding for 50 underprivileged couples last week and a musical event with Justin Bieber as the headliner. Sources familiar told Bloomberg that the guest list for this Friday's nuptials include Hillary Clinton, Boris Johnson, among the 1,200 people expected to attend. And that's your brief, John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the program, the White House comes out swinging.
So I am telling you that he has seen a neurologist 3 times while he has been in this presidency. That's what I'm saying. I am telling you that he has seen them 3 times. That is what I'm sharing with you, right? So every time he has a physical, he has had to see a neurologist. So that is answering that question.
Kinda. That conversation up next, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Equity futures on the S&P 500 positive by 0.25%. Yields are higher by a basis point. 10-year 428.81. Under surveillance this morning, the White House comes out swinging.
So I am telling you that he has seen a neurologist 3 times while he has been in this presidency. That's what I'm saying. I am telling you that he has seen them 3 times. That is what I'm sharing with you, right? So every time he has a physical, he has had to see a neurologist. So that is answering that question. Guys, hold on a second. There's no reason to go back and forth and be in this aggressive way. Every time I come back and I answer the question that you guys asked.
Correctly, you didn't have to come back and clean it up.
I never answered the question incorrectly. That is not true.
It's like kindergarten at the White House. My new favorite phrase, let's take a step back. How many times do you hear that? Let's take a step back. Let's take a step back. Here's the latest. We'll take a step back. The Biden administration trying to quell concerns after visitor logs showed a neurologist specializing in Parkinson's disease visited the White House 8 times over the past year. This coming after the president said he's staying in the race. Sarah Bianchi of Evercore outlining 3 reasons why she doesn't think Biden will back down. It's his decision to make. It would take an extremely strong push from his party to change his mind. And if he survives this week, attention shifts back to Republicans and the RNC. Sarah joins us now for more. So, Sarah, we understand your base case. What would change your mind?
Well, I'm watching a couple of things. One, I'm watching to see the meetings on the Hill today. They are finally really back and able to have conversations with each other to decide what they think should happen. And I'm watching in particular the leadership, not only Leader Schumer on the Democratic side and Hakeem Jeffries, but also Pelosi and Clyburn, who are very, very close to Biden. And then let's keep an eye on those senators and House members who are up in very, very vulnerable races. What are they saying? What is Bob Casey in Pennsylvania saying? Those are the voices that are going to be the strongest. And if they unite, and they will have to at this point, then they are going to, have a president who's a little bit more willing to listen to the perspective than he is right now. The second thing that I'm watching is the polls. We have not seen lots of state polls coming out. We should get some more this week. That will also be informative.
But Sarah, when it comes to the polls, the president yesterday, when he was on Morning Joe, talked about the fact that the majority of Democrats want to see him. But the polls going back a year now showed that most of these individuals, the American electorate, including Democrats, think he is too old. So how does he square this circle of the Democrats want me there, but all the polls for months have been showing actually they think he's too old to carry the torch?
Well, I think the point that he was making in that context was leadership, the leaders in the party. Look, your point is right. He has a really big challenge. It's hard to see the path right now for the president, given that he is down in some of the key states like Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona almost seem out of reach for him at this point. And Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, he would have to have a 3-for-3 sweep. And that is difficult, too. So you're right. The voters have been sending a message. But this president's perspective is that he's been counted out before and that he is the best one to take the case to the folks. And whether or not Democrats agree with that privately, they're going to have to mount quite an effort to change his perspective.
If he were to step aside, how do you view this playing out? Does it immediately go to the vice president?
It doesn't immediately go. He has to the president would have to release his delegates. And then there would be an open process in some sense to figure out who that nominee would be. That would happen at the convention, and somebody would have to get a majority of the delegates. I think what people are saying that's right is that process does favor Vice President Harris. She is more popular with that set of delegates than she is in the country across the board. There is a lot of women of color in that delegate group. There's a lot of people who care about choice, where she's been very active. So it does favor her. She is vetted. But there is certainly an opportunity for somebody else to get in. Part of what would matter is how Biden would frame it if he were to get out of the race. Would he and Obama and others really signal that they really want delegates to go that direction? Or would they say, you know what, this is really a time for our party to decide? Those are things I'd be watching for to decide how big Vice President Harris's advantage would be.
Sarah, there are so many double haters. There's so many people who are disenfranchised from the current system based on the fact that a lot of people don't like either option at this current point. Do you think that it basically undermines Joe Biden's argument when he basically says, get behind me or get out, and there's sort of this feeling that you need to coalesce around him and not speak publicly what you think privately, which has been the reason why there was such an outrage from the debate in the first place?
The president's trying quite vigorously. And by the way, I am surprised it took him as long as it did to really put up the fight that we've seen since Friday. That was really more than a week after the debate performance. So I think potentially he could have stemmed a bit more of this if he had got going a little bit early. That being said, his point is quite clear, which is he has won the delegates, the overwhelming portion. He has been through a process. And so I think he is trying to turn the page on this episode to tell people to move on or to challenge him at the convention. I think my sense of it is that if he makes it through this week and the conversation actually changes to the Republican convention, maybe to NATO in the week, then he's going to be in safer ground. And those who want him to step aside probably need to put together an organized effort, really starting today and this week to make that case, because certainly over the weekend he has come out swinging, as you mentioned, calling into Morning Joe, doing a range of events, and doing what this president does when his backup is against the wall, and that is to fire up a bit and press on.
Sarah, I'm glad you mentioned NATO. It feels like lame duck NATO, where you have Emmanuel Macron meeting with Joe Biden to talk about policy at a time where neither of them have particular domestic strength. How much is that going to be on display in a way that can't really be positive, given how much confidence can you get from any resolution that they come to, given they're all facing some really big challenges at home?
It's a great point. There are so many elections globally this year, not just in the United States and France, but across the board. And it's always challenging to govern in these kinds of really disruptive periods. That being said, there's a lot of issues on the board for NATO in and around Ukraine. And to the degree that voters think about this, certainly Biden has a different approach to addressing world leaders than we've seen with President Trump. He is a bigger believer in multilateral institutions. So he's going to try and use this opportunity to remind people why they should want him in charge. Again, very difficult to do on foreign policy issues, but you're right. It is a challenging time. And certainly when I travel around the world, leaders there are very focused on the United States election as well. And trying to plan for what their future might look like, no matter what happens in November.
Sarah, it's good to hear from you. Sarah Bianchi there of Evercore. We all know where the noise is. Let's talk about where the quiet is right now. And that's the VP pick of Donald Trump. And there's two reasons for that. One is obvious and one is less obvious. The obvious point is that he doesn't want to be in the news cycle right now, wants to keep Biden firmly front and center. The less obvious one is how what happens with Biden dictates or shapes his VP pick in the coming week. And I think that's the point here that maybe needs to be explored a little bit more.
He insinuated that last night when he called in to Sean Hannity on Fox, and he said, I have to have my VP pick. I know I need it for the convention. He said, I'd love to do it during the convention because that'll be exciting. But he also said, I'd love to see what's going on with the Biden camp because that could change things, but didn't elaborate on that. But potentially would that mean, does he need to pick someone from the African-American community? Does he need to potentially pick a woman?
What are these phone interviews about? You get a script and you can sit there and read it? Is that what it's about?
You do it in your pajamas.
Oh, right. You don't
That's
get
the
changed.
reason why.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, no bronzer.
5 days of gains on the S&P 500. Looks like we might make it day 6. We're positive by 0.2% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, up by 1/3%. You all know the number by now. It's, what is it, Lisa? 35 all-time highs on the S&P 500 so far in 2024.
Yeah, although the nature of it is shifting a little bit. As much as it is led by the Nasdaq, yesterday we saw outperformance by the Russell 2000, and you have a growing number of strategists saying maybe things have gotten a little over their skis with valuations with artificial intelligence-related names. That's the sort of shift that I'm very curious about, the sort of de facto broadening out simply because there's nothing left.
Is that a shift, or have we heard that the whole way up?
Well, we have heard it the whole way up, but we haven't necessarily seen it put into practice. And it comes at a time where it's not necessarily driven by bond yields. And I think that that's of note. It's also not driven by anything because essentially there's not a lot going on. I will just say that the NFIB Small Business Optimism Index did come out earlier this morning, and it came out at its highest level this year.
Let's turn the page to the bond market and talk about the 2-year. The 2-year yield inching higher after dropping for 3 consecutive days, inching higher yesterday and then again this morning. So 2 days of this now, up by about a basis point on a 10-year, just about unchanged at the front end now. At the front end of the curve on a 2-year at 462.85. Going into Chairman Powell, we have to sit on what inspired that bond market rally of last week, and that was the weak economic data and how responsive Chairman Powell will be to that going into the Fed decision later this month.
He has a tendency to want to be dovish. Does he really deep into his dovish soul and come out and deliver some sort of message that this should change the script? The problem with this is that the data is what you want it to be, and it continues to be that way. On a headline number, we've seen something like 42 straight consecutive months of job creation, of positive job growth. We've seen a lot of positive sort of signs in the economy and disinflation. No signs that are screaming huge issues, at least not to most people, take it in aggregate. You can tell your own story, so it's going to be interesting to see what he emphasizes, because then he'll be taking a view at a time when a lot of people are, kind of arguing on one side or another using the exact same data.
You can see why people are split, though. You can identify rising unemployment, and at the same time, someone else can say, but on a historical basis, we're still very, very low, in the low 4s. Is Chairman Powell in camp 1 or camp 2? Based on recent comments we've had from the Fed chairman, it sounds like he's in the latter and not the former.
Because he's been indicating that he wants to cut rates, and he's been doing it since late last year. Why? Because they want to get ahead of this, and they want to land that perfect soft landing. The issue is an upward trend in unemployment doesn't usually happen in a linear way. This time would have to be different for it not to. A lot of people have said a lot of things are unique about this cycle, so this time is different. Does he lean into that? And can he just remain agnostic at a time where you have George Goncalves and other people saying, we're on the threshold of a shift and he could be too late?
How difficult is it to make the argument that we plateau at these levels, these low levels in the low 4s on unemployment? Let's turn the page and get to the FX market. Euro dollar just about unchanged. Not much happening here. 108.28 on the single currency. Under surveillance this morning, another Democratic lawmaker telling President Joe Biden to pass the torch.
I think he should step aside. I think it's become clear that he's not the best person to carry the Democratic message. A lot of Democrats are saying, well, let's move on. Let's stop talking about it. We're not the ones who are bringing it up. We're not the ones who said anytime, any place. And only Joe Biden was on that stage with Donald Trump. Our constituents are bringing it up. The country is bringing it up. And the White House, campaign strategy of be quiet and fall in line and let's ignore it simply isn't working right now.
Congressman Adam Smith of Washington becoming the latest lawmaker to go public with a call for Biden to end his campaign. The president coming out swinging yesterday.
The president coming out swinging on multiple fronts, writing letters, joining TV shows. The issue you have with this is that Representative Adam Smith was talking about this behind the scenes privately. Now he's coming public. How many more individuals are set to come public? And you're going to have senators today meeting behind the scenes. And you go what Sarah Bianchi says. What is it going to take? Potentially some of those individuals in leadership positions, like a Senator Schumer, like Hakeem Jeffries, saying the calls are just too big. And to really bring it to Biden, that something has to happen.
As Sarah said, though, why did it take so long for him to come out swinging? It's taken more than a week for him to have a sort of response. Before he sat back and we heard rumors that he was saying, yeah, he has to prove himself for the next 4 days. Does he think that the interview proved it on Friday night? These are some of the questions that are swirling at a time where, the jury's still out.
I think there's two things. The campaign probably thought that internally, the Democratic Party would not be airing these grievances out loud, that they would, to Representative Smith's point, just get in line. Two, the president was out campaigning. He sat for an interview. They thought that would be enough. But then clearly after the weekend, they realized this is not going to quell some of these concerns.
Scripted radio interviews? Was that the interview?
2 scripted radio interviews. Well, I can't for sure say they were scripted, but obviously the president, I believe the campaign said, did have notes in front of him, a sit down with ABC. And then he was in Pennsylvania, where our poll shows Trump is leading by 7 points. Biden has to hold the blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, or it is a very challenging, pretty much zero path back into the White House.
How many people believe that was an off-the-cuff phone interview yesterday on US cable news?
Okay. Why is it phone? We all ask the same question, right? What is it about phoning into a television show? I don't know.
Everyone's asking if this was impromptu. Likely was not. It's interesting that the President of the United States decided to use a phone when there is a slew of cameras outside his door on Pebble Beach. I used to stand in front of one.
I always felt like with Donald Trump, it was a proper impromptu phone interview. I felt like he was consuming cable news that morning and he would just call into the control room and say, put me on.
Yeah.
Always felt like that was real. And there was certainly no script because he was all over the place. With Biden yesterday, with the president, it just felt like there was a script in front of him and he was reading from it and he was trying to be fiery. He was trying to come out swinging. How many people believed that? I don't know. Maybe the hosts, certainly the hosts, based on their reaction to it. But I don't know if many others did.
The interesting thing is, and Emery, you mentioned this earlier, is that this is something that's been swirling in the public imagination for a long time. It's just that some of the Democratic leaders are now saying the quiet part out loud. So a lot of this is sort of like, you can split hairs, but it's not changing anyone's view because you've already gotten the impression over so many months of, a lot of gaffes, et cetera. These are some of the issues that people are saying. So we can talk about it. But the jury is already gone for a lot of people who've been watching.
Biden yesterday, I'm getting so frustrated by the elites. This has been showing up for polls for over a year that he is too old. And his own party, Democrats, did not think he'd be the man to serve another 4 years.
I love this term, the elites. I'm sorry. If you've been in politics to 4, 5 decades and you yourself has become a multimillionaire, aren't you an elite now? You're the president of the United States. This idea that you're Scranton Joe, working class, blue collar, give me a break. 40, 50 years in politics and we're meant to sit here and believe you're not part of the elites, the establishment in Washington.
Well, and even if you do, 3 hours later, he's on the phone to some of those elites saying, thank you so much for supporting me. Please give me your money. I would like to speak to some of these people and wonder how much resonates or whether it's just sort of, you have to say that so everybody sort of believes that you're on their side.
We'll talk to a donor in about an hour from now. Let's turn a page to this story. It's connected. Former President Donald Trump is preparing to announce his running mate. Trump telling Fox News the vice presidential pick will be named in the coming week, possibly at the Republican National Convention. Here's the lineup. Senators J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, Governor Doug Burgum are all expected to be on the short list. And based on his comments yesterday, it sounded like he still doesn't know who he's going to pick.
These are also the obvious choices, right? Because they're showing up at the rallies, they're with him at the debate. There are some other names I would say you should throw into this mix. One, former Secretary Ben Carson. His name has been brought up to me a few times. And also, and the Wall Street Journal editorial board continues to bring up his name, and this would be what Terry Haynes has called a unity ticket light. Governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. This also is a man that potentially can help Trump win Virginia. And where did Trump go immediately after the debate? Virginia, and stood next side of him.
Watch this space in the next week or so. Watch this space this morning. Top of the schedule in Washington is actually this. It's NATO leaders looking to reaffirm support for Ukraine. Despite widespread problems at home, President Joe Biden, France's Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Olaf Scholz all heading to the summit in Washington with domestic distractions. Bloomberg's Piotr Skolomowski joins us now for more. Piotr, wonderful to catch up with you, sir. Walk us through what's meant to be the priority in Washington, D.C. this morning.
Hi, indeed. So the summit starts today, and what's obviously the 75th anniversary of the NATO. And what the leaders were supposed to come with is the sense of unity. But obviously what's it's going to be is it's going to be slightly different. What we're talking about is that, at least for the European leaders, they're all, or most of them, are slightly distracted by the fact that Emmanuel Macron is just now emerging from the election, where obviously the cordon sanitaire worked and the far right was repelled. They came third. But still, it's a deadlock. We don't know what's going to emerge, what kind of government are we going to have in France in the end. In Germany, Olaf Scholz, obviously, he didn't really, his party didn't do very well on in parliamentary elections, in European parliamentary elections. So the only leader who's coming there with sort of a mandate and strength is Keir Starmer. But still in the UK, his priorities are social spending, and it's not entirely clear whether and how quickly UK will deliver on the commitments on defense spending. So obviously, that's the picture we're seeing from Europe. And above all this, we also have Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, who's just angered all of the allies and EU leaders as well by first obviously visiting Volodymyr Zelensky last week, but then going to Putin and then going to China to meet Xi without ever consulting anyone in the EU. So he's also coming in. He's part of the NATO crew, part of the Hungary's part of the members of the membership. So that's kind of the picture that we are seeing. But above all this, the focus is obviously on the state of the U.S. politics and what happens to Joe Biden and what happens afterwards. After the election.
I'm really glad you brought up Viktor Orban. We were in Kyiv together when he was visiting Zelensky. He immediately went to Moscow and then to Beijing. How can this NATO group get anything done when it comes to fortifying Ukraine when you have the likes of Viktor Orban basically going against their will and meeting with Putin?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, obviously, they will just continue to carry on. I mean, the question is obviously how much spending that there can come, and there is a certain commitment to spend 40 billion to help Ukraine. What's been very difficult is that's the commitment for the next year. What they haven't achieved, and what's been sort of the goal of the outgoing NATO chief Stoltenberg, was the goal of a commitment for 5 years for 400 billion. So it's obviously Viktor Orban is one of the people who are openly against further aid to Ukraine. He's talking about peace deals, but at the same time, you're not seeing like full commitment from most of the European leaders to kind of commit for years on military spending to Ukraine. He's like the most obviously extreme example of where it's going, and obviously he talks about peace, which at this point it's really difficult to imagine how it's going to happen. So what we're going to get at the end is obviously the question is, as you mentioned, Zelensky said he's hoping to get some kind of invitation to join NATO. He's not going to get it. What he's going to get is some sort of a commitment that it's irreversible. The path towards NATO membership is irreversible, but there will be conditions attached. So we'll see how it goes.
Piotr Skolomoski, big week, not just for NATO, for the President of the United States. I think Justin Sink of Bloomberg called this the big boy news conference, and now everyone within the administration is calling this a big boy news conference, which sounds kind of odd, but that's taking place on Thursday, right?
The idea is that potentially he won't just take 2 to 4 questions because they have something to prove. Well, he offered up for more journalists in the room to ask more questions, and that potentially can quell some concerns. Does he perform better this Thursday than he did at the debate the previous Thursday 2 weeks ago? That's a big test coming up later this week. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. It's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Just wanted to revisit that Viktor Orban story. The Hungarian prime minister shocking his European and Western allies, paying recent visits, as Piotr mentioned, to both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. EU leaders have sought to distance themselves from Orban's shuttle diplomacy, which they emphasize does not represent the bloc. But their attempts to denounce his visits are complicated by the fact that Hungary has taken over the EU's rotating presidency. Orban now heads to Washington for that NATO summit. BP shares, it's going to check on them, slumping in London this morning, down 4 1/3%. The company warned of weaker oil refining and write-downs. BP sees significantly lower refining margins and says it will take up to $2 billion in impairments in the second quarter. The figure includes charges related to scaling back refining operations in Germany due to high costs and declining fuel demand. The Fed is considering a rule change that could save billions of dollars in capital for the U.S.'s largest 8 banks, according to a Reuters report. The update would impact how the Fed calculates an extra layer of capital and imposes on systematically important banks, known as the GSIB surcharge. The deliberations are reportedly still ongoing, with no final decisions yet made. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the programme, testing US growth.
Maybe the US can push that narrative, the fiscally driven growth narrative, a bit further, but how far are we going to test it? You only find that point of no return until after you've crossed it. Markets are pricing in on course for a September move.
That conversation up next, live from New York City. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance. Live from New York City, welcome to the program. Your S&P 500 positive by 0.25%. In the bond market, yields drifting higher by a single basis point, 429.20. And the surveillance this morning, testing US growth.
Maybe the US can push that narrative, the fiscally driven growth narrative, a bit further, but how far are we going to test it? You only find that point of no return until after you've crossed it. Markets are pricing in on course for a September move. Steeper curve, but in a gradual, normalized, steady manner, or is it going to be something less so? I think that's what markets need to watch out for.
So here's the latest this morning. Fed Chair Jay Powell giving his semi-annual testimony on Capitol Hill at 10 a.m. Eastern. Traders will be looking for clues about Fed policy in the second half of the year. Kelsey Berro of JPMorgan saying this: the Fed's motivation to cut may need to shift from fine-tuning policy to offset falling inflation to easing policy to protect a weakening labour market. If core CPI comes in at expectations, we would expect the Fed to start signalling for September. Kelsey joins us now for more. Kelsey, good morning. I'm always happy when people frame things this way because not all rate cuts are created equally. What kind of rate cuts are you expecting? The kind of bearish ones when you respond to labour market cracks, or the bullish ones where it's just about fine-tuning off the back of disinflation?
I think we're really teetering on the edge of those two options, and it's a little uncertain, where we're going to land. But I do think for now, we're still talking about rate cuts that are preemptive. It was at first when we started the year rate cuts that were preemptive because inflation was falling and that was going to give the Fed scope to fine tune. Now the rate cut narrative is shifting a little bit to we may need to protect the labor market. But again, that's still a preemptive action to keep the expansion going rather than one where we're worried about an immediate risk of recession.
We started this program this morning with a quote from Chairman Powell in Sintra, Portugal last week. I'll share it with the audience again. Because the US economy is strong and the labor force is strong, we have the ability to take our time and get this right. How much time do you think he actually has to get this right?
I think he does have some time, and that's because not everything is pointing to things turning very quickly. So even though we've seen this rise in the unemployment rate, even though the breadth of job growth has narrowed fairly significantly, we're still seeing an economy that's operating basically around trend. So you look at the Atlanta Fed GDP tracker right now, it's at 1.5%. And this is generally still an okay environment for most companies that our analysts talk to. So when you look in the investment grade, the high yield universe, I tell them growth is around trend right now. What does that mean for your companies? They say that's still a fine environment for us.
Which is the reason why some people are saying actually he should wait. I mean, there still are those people who are expecting, and I'm thinking of Torsten Slok, no rate cuts this year, because if you look at 35 record highs on the S&P 500, you look at some of these indicators, there still is quite a bit of strength. Why do you think the threshold is 0.2% on core CPI or below in the reading that we get on Thursday, and then it's all clear for September?
Well, that's the framework that I'm using for this week and how I think markets will react. Right now, you're kind of at a 50-50 on a cut in September. And I think by the end of the week, it's either going to be very close to 100% or that's going to start drifting down below 50% again. But I would say that right now, actually, the data is very clear and it's sending a green light to the Fed that they actually can adjust policy. So let's just take a very simple approach. Think about the Taylor rule, right? The Taylor rule has two functions. It's the inflation loss function and the job loss function. Well, right now, inflation is coming down and the unemployment rate is rising. Both variables are actually telling you that it's okay, particularly when policy is restrictive as it is, to start moving the policy rate down. Now we're really just talking about the semantics of exactly when they go. But in terms of, is the overall economy appropriate to start thinking about that reduction, I would say yes.
So if Neil Dutta is listening to this, he's banging the table saying, yes, 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 because that's what he's been saying. Just look at unemployment, look at inflation. That's all you need to know. They're both giving the green light. Some people might say, look at policy. Look at what's coming down the pike with tariffs, looking at what's coming down the pike with immigration, regardless of who becomes president. Doesn't this sort of raise the risks of sort of a reignition of inflation down the line, in addition to just year-over-year comps that become less easy as they have been over the past couple of months?
That's fair. I do think that for the short term, I'm still more focused on the economic data. And I think that on a day-to-day, you may see the markets react or overreact to the politics. But the market will, again, refocus on the near-term data because we know that markets can't focus on more than one thing at a time. But that being said, I know that we're focused on these huge headline figures for tariffs, 60% tariff rates, 90% tariff rates. But when I think back about the experience we had with the trade wars in the prior administration, the real impact from tariffs was not the inflation impact. It was the negative growth impact. So I think people are maybe a little bit too focused on the inflation impulse and a little not focused enough on what this may do for global trade and global sentiment and the negative growth impact associated with it.
If it's going to be more of a negative growth impact than inflationary impact, does that mean that the Fed is right also to cut before potentially we see those policy shifts?
I don't think that they're going to react before any of these policy shifts. So again, that's why, as it relates to how we're positioning portfolios for the next few months, I'm still primarily focused on what is happening in the current data, what is happening in the current economy, what is happening currently to companies. And then I think what's really key with our portfolios is not to be too dogmatic, not to be too stuck in one view, to stay nimble, to stay tactical, because there's been a lot of opportunities even in the last week. I think my colleague Ian was on talking about the elections in France. We mentioned that we were nibbling at oats. I mean, that was a classic overreaction, a period of time where it was short-lived. The market was focused on it. But then look what happened as the week progressed. We refocused on ISM services. We refocused on the jobs report. And ultimately, those opportunities to nibble were good ones.
Oats being French bonds and not breakfast, Kelsey, just to sort of clear that for our audience who maybe aren't.
You're just talking straight to me. I nibble on oats every morning.
With European bonds. Kelsey, what else have you been doing? What other opportunities have there been over the last month or so? Have you responded to that backup in yields off the back of political considerations here in the United States as well?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, that was kind of an interesting confluence of events. But we certainly looked at the price action, and I vividly remember it last Monday. And yields were backing up fairly substantially. We're testing 450 on 10s. We're getting closer to it. And it was on nothing related to the fundamentals in the U.S. economy. And, those are the moments when you can really look to yourself and say, okay, when the price action is really being driven by technicals, really being driven by factors that are outside the purview of the U.S. economy, do we have a view on what's coming next? And in that case, the risk reward looked actually very...
Just quickly, is that the playbook for the summer for you guys? If you get backups on yields off the back of political considerations, not economic data or the Federal Reserve, that's something you want to buy?
We have been approaching it that way. And we have to continue to stay nimble. But I do think that when you're looking at the risk reward on the labor market, we talked about the risk that it could be weakening. If the market is backing up for reasons unrelated to the fundamentals, that's a buying opportunity.
Kelsey, this was great. Phenomenal to get some insight into what you've been doing over the last month or so. Kelsey Berro there of JPMorgan. It's like the political considerations versus the fundamentals, the economic data. At some point, though, those political considerations can become the fundamentals.
Well, but what are the fundamentals? And I think that Kelsey's point there is really salient, which is some of these tariffs might have a one-time pop in inflation and the prices going up, but it's not continued inflation. It's actually depressive to growth because people will buy less. So this is sort of some of the dynamic that people are looking at under the hood and saying, hold up. Let's just really take a look at what the ramifications are.
We'll continue this conversation in the second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance. Up next, we'll catch up with Peter Tchir of Academy Securities, Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian, Democratic donor and advisor Trey Beck, and Wei Li of BlackRock. All of that still to come from New York City. Good morning.
What's helping to support the market is the majority expectation that we will experience a soft landing.
As you're approaching a soft landing, you have to obviously increase the odds that the hard landing is actually where you end up.
We've seen kind of head fakes before with the soft data and the hard data.
The Fed has to make the policy stance less restrictive sooner rather than later.
If they don't start to respond to what we're seeing in the consumer and the economy broadly, then we have a higher risk of that hard landing scenario that everyone was so fearful of.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
The second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now, counting you down to day one of semi-annual testimony for Chairman Powell on Capitol Hill a little bit later this morning in front of the Senate Banking Committee. Ahead of that, some of the commentary for you from the South Side. Neil Dutta, good friend of this programme, over at Renmac. The cost of doing nothing is going up. Citi's Andrew Honhorst thinks this labour market is getting closer and closer to the so-called danger zone. Andrew with this to say, rising unemployment, rising downside risk.
Which is what we've heard an increasing number of people, including Kelsey Berro, just saying basically they have an opening, they're getting the green light from unemployment going up and the fact that inflation's coming down. That's all you need to know. That's the same kind of line of reasoning that we've heard from Neil Dutta. Here's the question. Does he want to lock them in? Because if he says that and the data doesn't change and they have to go in September, is that what he wants to do, given he might not have the rest of the committee on his side?
A pretty interesting double screen taking place a little bit later this morning, 10 a.m. Eastern time. Take a look at the day ahead. This is what it looks like. At the same time, we'll be taking coverage of Chairman Powell's testimony to the Senate. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, goes in front of the House. And I imagine one might be about the economy and the other might be about something else.
She's supposed to talk about international finance. So you're going to hear a lot of people also want to talk about what's going on with those Russian frozen assets and some of the progress the administration has made, especially after the G7. But obviously, when it comes to Republicans asking her questions, it's going to be about, is the President of the United States, she is a member, a serious member of his cabinet, is he fit to serve? That's entirely what the next 24 hours in Washington, D.C. is going to be about.
Yeah, although, okay, it's hard to say that she's actually going to weigh in on that. Are they also going to ask her about the deficit, given that you're having all of these auctions, that this is still sort of percolating out there? I'm serious. I want to know what she has to say about the financing of this country.
Only you could make the turn to that, from the health of the president to the bond issues coming up a little bit later.
Is she going to say anything about the president's health?
She's going to be asked.
She's going to be asked.
Without
She's going to have to say, I have confidence in the president. Let's move forward, right? I mean, this is basically going to be the question. You could say, how much does it diminish the United States on the world stage that we're having these discussions? How much does that actually challenge some of the negotiations around Ukrainian aid? I'd love to hear that. And I also want to hear, how much does this diminish his ability to get certain things done having to do with the deficit?
She's probably practicing her answers now because she is going to be asked this question over and over and over again today. This is a moment for Republicans also to clip it ahead of their November campaigns in their districts.
All roads lead to one thing for Bramo. It's the deficit in the United States of America. Here are the scores in the bond market. We look like this on Treasuries. Unbelievable. The 10-year at the moment yields higher by a single basis point. The 10-year 4.29. In the FX market, bit of a snooze, 108.23 on the euro. In the equity market, nothing snoozy about it. 5 days of gains, looking like we might make it 6. On the S&P 500, equity futures positive by 0.25%. Coming up this hour, we'll catch up with Academy's Peter Tchir as the S&P 500 reaches another all-time high. Democratic donor Trey Beck as President Biden vows to stay in the race, and BlackRock's Wei Li on whether AI can keep driving the equity rally. We begin with our top story. Stocks hitting fresh record highs as investors await Fed Chair Jay Powell's testimony. Academy's Peter Tchir writing this. We have argued quite aggressively that the Fed should make their first cut in July, partly because the economic data supports it, but also taking the spotlight off of the Fed in the heat of the election. Peter joins us now for more. Pete, good morning.
Morning.
2 reasons. One's about the economy. The second is about the politics. So let's start with the second one. The politics. Why is that an important consideration for this Federal Reserve?
Well, I'm going to start with the first one, but basically every guest has been on saying September looks likely. They should be doing it. They should be acting sooner than later. I completely agree. And if anything, I would err to the side that they do it in July. If you do this in September, I just envision a world where this is going to blow up in social media. Clearly, if they cut in September, say stocks rally 3-5%, you will see the Trump campaign aggressively go after the Fed, blame them for playing favorites. It won't be the case, but the reality doesn't mean anything anymore, right? It's how these things play out in the social media narrative is what's important. You do the first cut in July, you'll get some flack, but it's July 31st. No one cares. It'll quiet down, and you can move on. And you set up a September rate cut, I think, much easier. That's how I would play it. You know, maybe you're not supposed to think that way, but to me it makes the most sense.
We've drawn a distinction repeatedly this morning between what they should do and what they will do. This is what you think they should do. What do you think they will do, and what do you expect to hear today from Chairman Powell this morning?
I think they're going to set us up for September. I think they're going to continue to look at the data. I think the data is going to come in weak. I'm hopeful that CPI comes in low enough. Maybe it lets them squeeze towards July, but I think it's already too late with the messaging. So I think we get that September cut, 25 then, another 25 in November, and then 25 in December. So we get 75 this year.
Some people would say that just because the Fed has even signaled the cut, we've already gotten the easing in financial conditions that have given a shot of stimulus to the economy. Why is that not the case as we have just experienced the 35th record high of this year?
Well, so for example, I just pulled up the equal weighted S&P, which month to date is down 0.2%. Year to date is up 3.5%. So this market has been very narrow rally, right? It's really all about AI, the AI story, this transitional. So I don't think we should set policy based on the excitement over AI, right? If AI is real, it might still be undervalued. So when you look at the broad market, you know, the Russell 2000 still done poorly, value stocks. So I think we get caught up in the broad indices. You look below the surface, markets are only doing okay. I think the job data is turning, it's turning fairly quickly. And with inflation around 2.8% or, you know, somewhere in that neighborhood, you don't want to risk a recession. Back when we were 5%, the Fed could afford to risk a recession, right? Inflation was so bad, so painful, they could do that. Now there's no reason to create a recession. So all those reasons tell me cut now, even if financial conditions look pretty decent. And what I've liked in the last week or so, 2s, 10s is widening. And I do think one thing people are going to, find mistaken this time is even as the Fed cuts, I don't think 10s and 30s are going to respond that much. I think 10s and 30s are going to focus on the deficit, the supply, and you're going to see 2s, 10s go back to zero, maybe slightly, even uninverted over time, and you're going to see that 430 to 450 range on 10s hold, even when the Fed begins cutting rates.
There's a lot to unpack there. Let's go to the deficit. I am curious about how much the politics of the moment. You guys are laughing at me. No, I'm serious, because this is something that people talk about. We just had Kelsey Berro on saying, buy the 10-year. I know you guys are laughing at my obsession. It is important at a time, especially when you have all of the bond auctions this week. How much are you looking at that as something that sort of takes away the opportunity to really buy into weakness?
So, I think that's why yields are going to stay somewhat high, stubbornly high at the long end. It comes up in conversation after conversation. And what I try and bring back is, if you remember August and September last year, where treasuries were for sale every single day. I think we went from 4% to 5%. No matter what the data was, maybe we'd rally briefly, treasuries would go for sale. There was a huge fixation on the deficit, our willingness to kind of talk about not paying. You're going to see episodes of that. It's not going to be nonstop. It's not consistent, right? Because this deficit's going to take time. But I would expect every year or so you get that sort of noise. Even earlier this year, right? We went from 390 to 470. Same sort of trend. So I think more and more you're going to see these breaks to the upside on yields because people fixate on the deficit, and neither party is going to change that.
But you don't buy those dips in price.
Not until we get high enough in that range, because I think everyone's comfortable with treasuries right now. I think people position too long. So down here at 430, I'm selling treasuries. Maybe they go to 420. I think we get back to 450 before long, even with the Fed cutting. I think that's going to be the realization is, whatever the Fed's doing at the front end is great, but it doesn't solve the deficit problem. It doesn't solve our long-term debt problems. And this overall supply is still real. So that's why I'm not that comfortable with the long end.
Can we go back to the optics, the political optics of the September cut? Take that a step further. It's not just going to be that the Trump campaign would come out and maybe say, they're in the tank for President Biden. If Trump is elected, does this give him the excuse with his own party to go back to that Wall Street Journal report, which is that they want to blunt the independence of the Fed?
Yeah, I think over the last year or so, right, there's a lot more both from Trump and others talking about the Fed's independence, questioning, Congress, what Congress says over the Fed. I think if they cut in September, it leaves them much more open to, under a new administration, attack about what their mandate is, whether they have to be rule followers, how much flexibility they have. Again, I think all of that may play out one way or the other. I think it's less likely if they do this in July. And again, the data is there for them to think about cutting. And you would argue, right, I think other people there's this lag effect. Why not get a couple cuts in earlier? I just feel it would be very prudent and better for the Fed's long-term health and independence to get something done sooner than later.
And does he need to signal that today?
I think he should be pretty strong about if we get good enough data in the coming weeks, we could cut sooner. And that kind of gives him a little bit of, like CPI, I think will actually be a miss, so it'll be lower than expected. So I don't know whether that's now a miss or a win anymore, and however we want to interpret it. But I think we'll get a lower CPI. Any problems with CPI will either be one-off things explainable, or they'll be housing related, which everyone now knows is lagged effect. It's one reason the Fed looks at PCE, and I've been learning more and more about this, but supposedly it would take an act of Congress to change how CPI uses that, which is why people go to CPI. You know, you look at anything like Zillow or anything that's kind of contemporaneous rent, rents come way down, so it's artificially inflated. I think those are the things that give him the leeway between the jobs report and that to like put July on the table.
Kelsey Berro was with us about 10, 15 minutes ago, and she really drew a distinction between cutting interest rates to fine-tune policy in response to disinflation and cutting interest rates in response to a much weaker labour market. Now, I said that there were bearish rate cuts and bullish rate cuts. I'd actually like your opinion on that. Do bearish rate cuts exist? Are there rate cuts that are bearish for this market?
You know, I think it's all relative what's been priced in. So right now, I think, yeah, if we had a really, steep drop in employment, then we get a bearish rate cut, and maybe equities couldn't keep up and couldn't keep going. But as it stands right now, I think everything's going to be really positive. I think we're all sitting there trying to watch what triggers this breakout, though, of the Russell 2000, the value, the equal weighted versus. That still, to me, isn't clear, right? It feels to me we've been on this path where the data is good enough, you should see the broad economy doing well. The Fed's accommodating enough, you should do that. And those still aren't working.
We all remember November 2016, and we've talked about this a few times. Small caps rallied almost 11% in November 2016 on the Trump election. I think the question we've all gone back to around the table in the last couple of weeks is just how relevant that playbook is this time around. Is it relevant at all?
You know, I'm kind of ignoring most of the election stuff. I think, one, it's too clear what's going to go on, who's going to be even representing. And I think we see time and time again, right, whatever they say they're going to do, the policies wind up coming much more narrow. I've been a big fan of Mexico recently, right? There was a lot of concern after the Mexican elections that it would change. You saw the Mexican pace. All that's coming back to normal, right? Whatever you say to get elected and whatever you wind up doing tend to be two very different things. So I'm paying very little attention to any of the rhetoric. And I would say, on top of all of it is, it feels that people are very willing to put their own interpretations on it. So if you're
hold up. If we get politically induced dislocations in the markets through this summer, you're a buyer. You take
I am
the other
generally
side.
a buyer, yes.
That's exactly what Kelsey Berro said 10 minutes ago.
Even though her sense of what to buy was somewhat different. So that's, I guess, my question to you. What are you a buyer of during these dislocations?
So the one thing I would say, maybe slightly different, is I do like energy. And I would say when you look at the world right now, you've got Putin, dictator, Xi, dictator, Kim, dictator, Khomeini, effectively a dictator. They have to be looking at what's going on here, and they probably don't understand our political system, but they see the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief, internally focused, facing all these questions. I think the risk that someone takes some action and tries to take advantage of that over the summer is much higher. So I am looking for the potential for a geopolitical risk. That I would not fade, and that's why I kind of want to own commodities ahead of that. I think almost anything that gets done would affect energy prices in particular. And on top of that, not quite even in that same vein, we're sitting here, all this internal focus. Oban's traveling to Russia, right? Putin and Modi met. The rest of the world's moving on while we're internally focused. That I don't like for the future.
I've got to squeeze this in. You're surrounded by generals at Academy. You just said take advantage. What does taking advantage look like? What does that mean?
You know, I think if you watch what's gone on, right, the last time we did funding for Ukraine, right, a lot of this plays out in social media, how difficult that was to get over the hurdle. You watch what's been going on with Israel and Gaza, where we're supposed to support, what we're not supposed to do. A lot, again, plays out in social media. So we're having a lot of activity around the Second Thomas Shoal in the Philippines, a couple hundred miles off the coast of Philippines. Would anyone really care? What would we do if something like that? So I think we're already stretched. We're engaged in two wars. Neither of those are going smoothly, certainly by any stretch of the imagination. So do you push the envelope? Do you do something different? I think China could do something. Maybe, North Korea's been extremely quiet. Do you get weapon sales? Something to just shake it up where they view that, one, we're stretched, two, they can use misinformation, social media to push against us. And time frame is ripe for that, where we already had enough questions without their misinformation.
Pete, we could do this all hour. It's good to see you. I know you've got to go. Peter Tchir there of Academy Securities. So let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. A check on BP shares in the London trade down 4 1/3% after warning of weaker oil refining and write-downs. Boeing sees significantly lower refining margins and says it will take up to $2 billion in impairments in the second quarter. The figure includes charges related to scaling back refining operations in Germany due to high costs and declining fuel demand. Donald Trump says that he hasn't decided who will be his vice presidential pick. He was speaking to Fox's Sean Hannity and said that he plans to make an announcement in the coming week. The former president said his running mate would be, quote, a person that can do a fantastic job as president, as well as somebody that helps you get elected, and there's nothing wrong with that. Trump said Senators J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum were under consideration. Hamad International Airport in Qatar takes the top spot in this year's Air Help survey of the world's best airports. The rankings are partially based on customer feedback, along with the quality of food and shopping at 239 airports globally. Punctual arrivals and departures represent 60% of the score. Rounding out the top three were Cape Town International Airport in South Africa and Chubu Centrar International Airport in Japan. One U.S. airport cracked the top 10, and that was Salt Lake City International Airport. And that's your brief, John.
And nobody's surprised. Danny, thank you. We'll catch up with Danny in about 30 minutes' time. I love this country. It's just the airports, OK? Just for the record.
I just want to say,
just the airports.
LaGuardia has gotten a lot better.
I agree.
Comparatively to what it was, but you stack it up against airports around the world, is it that great? Also, the traffic getting in and out. It's awful.
At JFK is just, I know. How long have we got to wait now? 2 years for them to fix JFK?
I agree. And getting in and out, you might as well just take public transportation. It's better off, just a PSA. Newark does look like you're flying into a third world country.
Yes, it really does. Up next on the program, the White House firing back.
Has the president been treated for Parkinson's? No. Is he being treated for Parkinson's? No, he's not. Is he taking medication for Parkinson's? No. So those are the things that I can give you full-blown answers on.
Coming out swinging yesterday, line of the morning, favourite line of the morning so far. If you missed this, it was an absolute winner. There's a lot to unpack. So let's talk about the deficit. Does it get better than that? Peter could have been talking about anything.
Okay, hold on a second. He was talking about the deficit, which is the reason why he's not buying treasuries when they dip. Those are not the opportunities. It was actually relevant to the conversation.
Got it. All right. That's not next. This is Bloomberg. Stocks on the S&P 500 positive here by 0.2%. Let's talk about the deficit. Yields are higher by, I'm going to repeat that all morning. Yields are higher by a basis point or two. The 10-year 429.59. Under surveillance this morning, the White House firing back.
I can tell you this, just going back to Parkinson's for a little bit, so to give you some answers here. Has the president been treated for Parkinson's? No. Is he being treated for Parkinson's? No, he's not. Is he taking medication for Parkinson's? No. So those are the things that I can give you full-blown answers on, but I'm not going to confirm a specialist, any specialist that comes to the White House out of privacy.
So here's the latest. President Biden vowing to stay in the race despite mounting concerns over his fitness for a second term. White House visitor logs showing 8 visits in the past year by a neurologist specializing in Parkinson's disease. Joining us now from Washington is Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian. Jordan, have you ever seen that room as hostile as it was in this administration?
It was one of a handful of moments where things got very heated, and these moments have tended to happen when the press secretary is not forthcoming about something that was plainly obvious to everyone in the room. And this was, as you just mentioned, a neurologist who specializes in Parkinson's disease visiting the White House complex 8 times. Now, it took the White House until yesterday evening to say why that Dr. Kevin Kennard was at the White House, that he was conducting clinical consultations, treating some other military members. But her stonewalling in the middle of the day just made the story worse for the White House and certainly got the hackles up of the reporters in the room.
Jordan, I woke up to that letter from the president's physician in my inbox and thought, why did it take them hours to get ahead of this? The story's been circulating for a few days. Why is it taking them so long to get ahead of all of these issues, including Biden yesterday coming out swinging? Why did it take him a week after the debate?
Yeah, it's puzzling. These are all good questions, Anne-Marie, and there's no real clear answers to them. This is a press operation throughout Biden's presidency that has struggled to get the message out, that has struggled to get ahead of stories, as you just mentioned, to drive the narrative on what they want to talk about versus getting put on their back foot. And that was another example that happened yesterday. The problem for them is the stakes are incredibly high, and any misstep at this moment, post debate for Biden is going to get examined, 10 times more intensely. And so they haven't adjusted their approach. They only started this full court press to try to save Biden's presidency more than a week after that debate. And that's why they're digging out of such a deep hole that they're in.
Jordan, John brought this up earlier, and it was that moment a few days ago with Justin Sink and Karine Jean-Pierre about the, quote, big boy press conference. What can we expect from the president on Thursday?
Well, Thursday at 5:30 or so, he's going to appear before the press. And look, I mean, we're going to have to see whether this qualifies as a so-called big boy press conference, as my colleague Justin put it. Is he going to stand up there for an hour, take questions, all comers, or is this going to be a tightly controlled affair like we've seen throughout this White House? A lot of Democrats, it's emblematic because a lot of Democrats have wanted to see Biden put himself in more unscripted settings, speak more off the cuff. And we've seen him do a little bit of that. He's done the interview with George Stephanopoulos. He called into Morning Joe yesterday morning on MSNBC, but he hasn't really let it loose like other presidents I've covered who've just been unafraid to take all questions, all comers. So we'll have to see if Biden does it on Thursday. And if he doesn't, there could be more backlash that he could face from his fellow Democrats.
And Jordan, there's already been quite a bit of backlash. We've been talking about the Democratic elected officials that have come out saying that Joe Biden should step down. Why are the progressives, one of the wings, that are now actually coming out with aggressive support for the sitting president?
Well, one thing we've seen, Lisa, is groups that make up Biden's base. So like labor unions, voters of color have been some of the most outspoken supporters of Joe Biden since this debate crisis occurred. And the more vocal segments of the party that have been calling him to step aside are the donors, some of the party consultants, more of the so-called elites that Joe Biden called out in his interview yesterday morning. And so I think you're seeing some of those progressive members respond to their constituents, respond to the people who support them, and voicing their support in that way. And so what you're seeing Joe Biden do is actually kind of divide his party between black voters, union voters, and the so-called elites. Now, that might help him save his presidency in the short term, but in the long term, you're heading into a November election with a divided party against Donald Trump, who has the Republican Party in an iron grip. That's going to probably hurt his chances of winning even further.
Jordan, just a thought exercise. Do you think if the former president could move the RNC, the convention, maybe a couple of weeks, do you think he'd push it back?
That's a great point, Jonathan. He's been content to sit back and just let the storm clouds gather around Biden. But look, this is Donald Trump. I mean, he's playing a disciplined politician now, but this is a guy who has constantly gotten in his own way throughout his time in politics. And I'm sure, he is itching to get out there and say things. And look, if you look at his true social account, the social media accounts, he was on Sean Hannity last night. He's been itching to get out there. He likes the spotlight on him, whether it's good or bad for him. So, maybe his consultants want the debate to happen at a later date, but I'm sure Donald Trump wants to get up on that stage.
Hey, Jordan, great to get your views. Come back soon. Jordan Fabian there of Bloomberg News on the week ahead for the sitting president and a big week next week for the former president.
Absolutely. It's the RNC, so he has to come out with his VP pick. He said it himself. I'd love to maybe wait. Maybe I'll do it at the RNC. My team says I got to go. He's got to announce.
The next couple of days, we're all waiting for it. Up next on the program, Trey Beck, Democratic donor and former managing director of DE Shaw Investment Management, joining us on this program. Looking forward to his thoughts just around the corner. If you're checking in on the price action right now on the S&P 500, equity futures are positive by 0.2%. Yields are a little bit higher on a 10-year by 2 basis points. Your yield this morning, 429.78. Equities on the S&P firmer here, positive by 0.2% on the Nasdaq 100, up by a third, another all-time high to close yesterday on the S&P 500. If you switch at the board and get to the bond market, 2-year, 10-year, 30-year, let's talk about the deficit, Bramo. Okay, let's talk about the debt that's coming to market today. $58 billion of 3-year notes. And then tomorrow, $39 billion of 10-year notes. Day after, Lisa, $22 billion of 30-year bonds. I don't need to tell you that. You know these numbers by heart.
Okay. So some people might say, why should we care about the deficit? Why should we care about these auctions? You don't care about them until you do. This is the reason why we've seen this sort of range that the bond, long bond in particular, has been trading in. We heard from Kelsey Berro, buy the dip, buy any kind of sell-off in longer-term bonds on political noise. Then you have Peter Tchir, also buy the dip to political noise, but not with treasuries, because he thinks that actually they're going to sell off further. And why? Because of the deficit. This is the reason why you might see a bigger term premium than you otherwise might see. I think it's interesting.
I'm pleased you brought up Kelsey and Peter just to extend some of this conversation. There is a tug of war right now between political considerations and the decelerating economic data, the fundamentals, so to speak, and the political speculation. But at some point, that political speculation can become real, can actually influence the fundamentals. And I think that's what's difficult for a lot of people right now. What do you do with these so-called political dislocations in the market when this could get more and more real as the year progresses and we get closer and closer to November?
And exactly to that point, Kelsey and Peter had completely, actually, opposed views on how to take advantage of political dislocations, because the view of exactly how this is going to play out, whether it's going to play out in policy or not, or whether the economy is going to just overwhelm that, or whether it's going to be basically played out in the international sphere with some sort of geopolitical incident. By the way, Peter's saying that some of these leaders don't really understand the U.S. political system. I think at this point, a fair number of us might also have some difficulties.
Yeah, I think all of us included right now, given the way the last week's gone. We'll try and give some clarity if we can in the next couple of minutes. Let's switch to the board and get to the euro, the single currency. Things have been confusing in Europe. They always are. In the FX market, the euro is 108.17. We're negative by 0.06%. Some stability off the back of the second round of voting in France. And I guess we'll take that, Lisa, after the mess of the last few weeks.
And you've seen this play out in the bond market as well, at least with respect to the spread between French bond yields and German bond yields. Question is, really, has anything been resolved? And the answer is a resounding no. So is this just basically people thinking about the worst case scenario, or is this just simply the people who are nibbling on oats, as Kelsey Berro
Nibbling on oats.
Yeah.
I love that. It sounded like breakfast.
Well, it is
It
breakfast
really
for
did.
me.
Yeah,
I like oats.
French bonds is breakfast for you, Bramo. Killer line. Under surveillance this morning, United Airlines saying one of its Boeing jets lost a wheel while taking off yesterday in Los Angeles. It's nearly a repeat of an incident in March that helped trigger a federal safety review of the carrier. OK, I don't have the answers, but I've got a big question. And we'll ask Helane Becker a little bit later this morning in about 45 minutes. At what point do we stop talking about Boeing and start talking about the airlines when you see incidents like this take place?
Well, obviously, it's not good for either of them. It's deja vu, and not the good kind of deja vu, because this exactly happened to the carrier in March. But and that launched the FAA investigation. But it's a great question. Is this a Boeing issue or is this a United issue? Because it happened once again to United. And I think that's what this investigation, the FAA, is going to try to find out.
And it's difficult to really parse because United does have a disproportionately high number of Boeing planes. So there is this sort of duality of it. I will say, though, it might be a similar problem plaguing both of them, which is there were a lot of employees who retired with a lot of institutional knowledge, including a lot of the tech staff, et cetera. How much was that the problem, both with Boeing and potentially even United support staff, if you lose that expertise in a highly skilled profession, and it's hard to hire those people back?
Are the skies too busy as well? With that in mind, relative to the absence of the expertise that you've just described?
You know, it's difficult for me to say because I enjoy traveling, and if I say the skies are too crowded, that means less volume, which means much higher prices, and that would be a big problem. We don't see planes crashing in the air. So, you know, hopefully we can move forward.
Record numbers over the weekend. Thanks for that, Lisa. I think we're all touching wood after that. Let's get to a different story. US consumer borrowing rising in May by the most in 3 months. Total credit outstanding soaring to $11.4 billion after a revised $6.5 billion gain in April. This all according to Federal Reserve data. This once again extends the conversation around what we talk about in the labour market, which is what is normal and what is deterioration when you look at stats like that.
Does it mean that people don't have the income to support the spending and are therefore borrowing as a result? These are the kinds of indications people are looking at to understand the turn in the cycle. That's really the key. At what point are we turning into something that's a little bit more malignant than just sort of a welcome softening?
This is the hard data that's come up in that recent Michigan survey when you had people saying that they normally identify as the middle class, but they feel like they are now in the lower income stratosphere of the electorate. You see this in polls again. Inflation, this is what people are struggling with. And this data shows that potentially now they're relying on credit cards.
Unemployment's very low still, in the low fours, but this consumer's stretched in certain places. And for a long time, those labour market stats at the aggregate level, the headline level, have masked what's happening beneath the surface.
I wonder if you dig beneath the surface of these numbers, whether there's a disproportionate number of younger people, of people in lower and middle income families who account for that much bigger than expected increase in borrowing.
We'll come back to that story a little bit later. I want to turn to this one. It's been the #1 story for the last 2 weeks in this country. President Biden is now pledging to stay in the race, brushing aside concern from Democratic lawmakers and donors. Biden saying, "I don't care what the millionaires think. I want their support. But that's not the reason I'm running." Democratic donor Trey Beck saying he would like to see Biden drop out. Trey, I'm pleased to say, joins us now. Trey, wonderful to catch up with you, sir. For people in the audience who aren't familiar with you, can you just share with us how you've supported Democratic causes, this president, in years gone by, and what changed for you 2 Thursdays ago?
So I've been a defender of President Biden as, first of all, his presidency. I think by any objective measure, he's done an extraordinary job. He has passed 2 infrastructure bills, one of them bipartisan, CHIPS bill, prescription drugs, addressing, real issues for Americans. And I think on a sort of degree of difficulty adjusted basis, if you consider he's facing an incredibly hostile opposition, one that in many cases doesn't even recognize the legitimacy of his clear win in 2020, right? Those are the conditions in which he's operating. I think he can make a case he's the best Democratic president of my lifetime in terms of what he has accomplished. I supported him in 2020. I supported him again in this cycle. And to be clear, however this resolves, I will support him or whoever the Democratic nominee is. And I think that's an important note. I think whatever happens with this inter-family squabble, we're going to have to unify around our candidate. And if that's Biden, I will get behind him. I'll walk on glass for the guy. What's changed is that the debate confirmed, the concerns that I think everybody had. And I think most notably voters. I think the Biden campaign has very understandably come out and shrewdly attacked this as sort of a cabal led by elites or donors, millionaires, in that quote you just showed. If I were them, that's what I'd say too. But I think what's actually happening here is that, in a sense, donors and the electeds who've come out, and I've talked to electeds privately who share their concerns and would like a change, but are not there yet to do it publicly. And I understand some of the calculations there. I think what's happening is people are coming around to exactly the view that voters have been expressing through polls for a year. I think that's what's going on. And so I think that what the debate confirmed, and for that matter, the radio interview he did and the Stephanopoulos interview, they have confirmed the degree of impairment from age. So it's true, everyone knew that, this was an 81-year-old man running for president, and that's hard. What we were hoping for was that he was anomalous and that he would have the stamina and acuity to do this. And I think what a lot of people are saying now is we need a candidate who can express, who can make the case, with the vigor that this moment deserves, given the authoritarian threat that we face in Trump and the administration that he would install.
Trey, is the concern with you and the people you're speaking with about Biden winning in November or Biden's ability to govern for the next 4 years?
I think the two are related, right? So historically, Biden has represented a vote for safety. In 2020, he was, old by the standards of somebody running for president, but he was considered establishment. He was coherent. He was not saying crazy things and threatening authoritarian policies like the alternative, which was Donald Trump. I think what some voters are struggling with now is they already know Trump is a bad guy. They know he lies. They know he's literally a criminal. He's a convicted criminal. They know he is threatening policy implementation that they don't agree with, whether it's reproductive rights, firing, much of the civil service and installing loyalists, using the judiciary to punish people. But they're struggling with this because they now see a less vigorous Joe Biden. And I don't blame Joe Biden for this. I believe that the Biden campaign, when they greenlit this campaign, had a different candidate. And I think what we've seen is significant impairment. I'm not a doctor, but I saw what I saw, and others saw what they saw. And we need somebody to make the case during the campaign. And then, of course, should we win, and I fervently hope we do, we want someone with the vigor to do one of the hardest jobs in the world. Now, I want to make clear, I don't have any substantive concerns about Biden's age. You're not electing one person, you're electing a team, in my mind, and many, many people I know understand this. You're talking about an army of bureaucrats, high and low. And I know the team that Trump is assembling. I know what he assembled previously, and what he's talking about doing now is worse and frightening. And I know that Biden is surrounded by hyper-competent people handling things domestically and abroad. But the way most voters see it is they see two names on the ballot, or in this case, maybe 3 or 4, depending on the state they live in.
But Trey, didn't his team around him do the American people a disservice by hiding a lot of these issues that they have over the past few months that we saw out full display for 90 minutes on CNN 2 Thursdays ago?
A lot of people are making that case. I don't know what the campaign sees. I don't know what his staff sees on a day-to-day basis. I'm not here to make that sort of allegation, of a cover-up. What I'll say is we did see what we saw. I think we've seen things previously, and people rightly say, well, haven't there been signs of decline or physical impairment, slower gait, et cetera, prior to the debate? Absolutely. But I think what we were hoping was that those were anomalous. And I think when we saw on the biggest stage the performance we saw, it confirmed a lot of people's concerns.
Yeah, well, Trey, there's also this issue of whether Joe Biden is currently operating at the same playbook, with the same playbook, in some ways, that Donald Trump is, by just simply coming out and being defiant and saying, people get in line. Yeah, so on the one hand, I do find that dispiriting that, he's describing, everyone as either a cabal of elites or, acting in bad faith. On the other hand, the positive of that is he's fighting, and he's showing the sort of scrappy Joe that got him elected. His campaign has clearly mobilized and forced to, enlist allies. Now, a lot has been made of those allies and saying, well, look, the labor movement, people of color who are historically, critical to his political power are lining up behind him. I think that's a very, good political line of attack by them, but I don't think it's substantively true. I think what you've seen is elites from those, labor union leaders lining up behind them. And by the way, privately, labor union leaders have expressed grave concerns to me. I've also, I can cite any number of polls that show that people of color are deeply concerned about Biden's age. Something like 64% of all voters would like Biden replaced on the ticket, and that includes 55% of black voters. So I think it's substantively not true that the average person of color who's a voter has no concerns at all about Biden's age.
Trey, appreciate your input today. We're going to have to do this again soon. Trey Beck there,
Thank you.
The Democratic donor, on the latest with the president, how much things changed for him 2 Thursdays ago. Let's take the opportunity to get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Nike is bringing back a retired executive to try to revive its slumping sales, according to a memo obtained by Bloomberg. 30-year veteran executive Tom Petty is returning as Nike's vice president of marketplace partners. He left Nike in 2020. Now the company is trying to rebuild relationships with retailers like Foot Locker after pulling products from many stores in favor of its own shops, e-commerce and apps. The company's stock has declined 33% this year through Monday, with sales continuing to fall. Pershing Square USA launched a roadshow for the initial public offering of its common shares. The hedge fund management company is expected to list at $50 a share, and it's seeking to raise $25 billion from that offering. That would make it the largest fund of its kind in the U.S. Pershing Square will apply to list the shares on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol PSUS. Much of Houston remains without power in Tropical Storm Berro's wake. Authorities warn that the blackout could last for days. More than 85% of the city lost power, and at least one person was killed after Berro made landfall yesterday. Most of the outages are in Houston and areas to the southeast where strong winds and heavy rain knocked out electric lines. The city is now facing threat of high temperatures, with the National Weather Service posting a heat advisory for the region through Wednesday. And that's your brief. John.
Danny, thank you. Up next on the programme, AI in the driver's seat.
There's policy fog, but I think there's opportunities for money to work in certain sectors. You got all this demand for AI, these data centers. There's only one country really that can feed this beast, right? This AI beast in a relative way, and that's the United States.
The latest from BlackRock, up next. Let's get you a check of the market. The scores look like this on the S&P 500. Equity futures positive throughout this morning, up by 0.2% as yields bleed a little bit higher, up by 2 basis points. The 10-year just short of 430 at 429.98. Under surveillance this morning, AI in the driver's seat.
There's policy fog, but I think there's opportunities for money to work in certain sectors. You got all this demand for AI, these data centers. There's only one country really that can feed this beast, right? This AI beast in a relative way, and that's the United States. These companies are backing up these valuations with earnings growth, and we see that continuing.
Here's the latest. The S&P notching its 35th record high of the year so far as earnings season kicks off this week with big banks. Tech set to report at the end of the month with the AI story very much at the forefront. Wei Li writing this in BlackRock's 2024 mid-year global outlook. We have seen the AI theme drive broader equity returns in the first half of the year. We're sticking with our overweight. Wei joins us around the table. Wei, good morning.
Good morning.
The mid-year outlook's just dropped, I think, a couple of minutes ago, so thanks for coming on straight afterwards with us. Your highest conviction overweight, I think, is Japanese equities. You've maintained this overweight on US equities as well. Let's start with the US and then we can move over to Japan. Walk me through the US call, what really underpins, what the biggest pillar of that call is.
Absolutely. So we can look at the cyclical factors. If we look at kind of the first half of the year, we have had positive surprises on earnings driven by AI. We had negative surprises on rates driven by Fed repricing. As we look ahead to the second half of the year, maybe we have less negative surprises from rates, maybe even positive as we head into rate cuts, but less positive surprises on earnings just because the bar has risen. But the bigger picture is, which is something that we lay out in the outlook, we've got to look beyond the cyclical ebbs and the flows and really focus on the transformations that are happening around us. So AI is driving that, but the low carbon transition is driving that as well. When we add up the capex numbers from these transitions, from these transformations, we're talking about magnitude comparable to the industrial revolutions, comparable to the internet revolutions. So we really think that we're moving from the financial economy to the real economy, and investing needs to change as well. It doesn't mean, given the elevated uncertainty, we need to de-risk. In fact, we need to properly use risk budget to lean into the transformation, but it does mean that we're going to be more selective, be more active, and private market plays a bigger role.
You offered some historical examples. Let's dig into that just a little bit more. Sometimes you can identify the mega force with ease. How easy is it to sort of identify the winners of these mega forces? Just taking the internet as an example. The internet was a big deal, but sometimes it was difficult to identify who would be the ultimate winners of that mega force. How easy is it this time around?
It's hard. It's hard. It's highly uncertain. So if we think about the various forces that are playing out, it actually means that as we look ahead to the future, there is an unprecedentedly wide range of outcomes possible. So no longer can we think about investing around a central base case with deviations around it, but we need to think about it in terms of scenarios that can be very different from each other, that may have very little overlap with each other. So that's how we kind of rethink investing and portfolio construction as a whole. But as we think about kind of identifying winners and losers, because this is an environment that does create more winners and more losers, we need to think about it in sequencing, in stages, right? So phase one of AI is really around AI build out. So there's need for energy, competition, arms race for energy and data center build out. And phase two is around really kind of the broader adoption, companies building out their AI capacities. We're seeing healthcare already doing that. Phase one and two can both be inflationary because we're talking about creating demand before the benefit on the supply side and productivity side can really come through. Phase three is around productivity boom, but that's hugely uncertain. And it cannot happen if phase one and two does not happen. So it will have to be inflationary first before it can be deflationary.
Which is the reason why when you talk about going long high quality bonds, you're talking about short term. Before we get there, before we get to Japan, I know we should get there, but I really want to dig in with the idea of AI being a trade that is very hard to sort of distinguish. You have Citigroup talking about how some of the AI-exposed high flyers are probably overbought. We've been hearing the B word, bubble, in, say, certain stocks like NVIDIA. Does the AI trade include some of those names that have already gotten bid up dramatically?
Yes, at the current juncture, yes. So our U.S. equity overweight also include the tech sector overweight, telecommunication, communication services overweight as well. But we are starting to broaden out our kind of AI play as well. So the initial beneficiaries are the likes of Magnificent Seven. And just to note, their earnings have come through. Their earnings have been revised a lot, and they have actually give or take delivered, if not beat expectations. So valuation is not as stretched as the price appreciation would suggest. But as we think about kind of the phase two of AI implementation, as broader sectors starting to adopt AI and benefit from the gain, efficiency gain, we have sectors like financials and healthcare and industrial as well positioned for the AI infrastructure build out. We want to include them in our AI play as well. And if we look at kind of the earnings picture, the last earnings season, we had 8 out of the 11 sectors growing their margins, which is incredible, showing a sign of broadening out. Looking ahead, tech is still expected to lead, but sectors like energy and healthcare are also expected to drive earnings growth in the second half of the year.
Okay, so just a really short bit on Japan. I know that that's your biggest overweight. I wonder how much this is sort of betting on a Bank of Japan rate cutting cycle that isn't necessarily a rate hiking cycle, excuse me, that isn't exactly tightening, but is an adjustment to deal with where the yen's at.
I would say that our Japan core is actually mostly a micro core at this juncture. The macro story, exiting deflationary decades and benefiting kind of from the macro lift, inflation coming back, we have already benefited from that. Now we're looking at companies delivering earnings. Expectations are for Japanese equities to grow earnings by 7-8% in the coming 12 months. We think that they can do better. You look at the latest AGM season, corporate governance, shareholder reform, that's progressing as expected. The currency, we talked about it not that long ago, is somewhat inconvenient because it's so volatile. It's been very, very weak. In part, it's helped earnings upgrades for manufacturing part of the Japanese equity market, but more broadly for foreign investors, it's just so volatile. It's gotten to a point, initially weaker currency was helpful for Japan achieving their inflation targets. Now, as we head into kind of election cycles in Japan as well, both for the party as well as for the country next year, it's less helpful. So I think there will be policy, we're not talking about explicit intervention, but maybe encouraging repatriation of foreign ownership back into Japan, maybe attracting foreign inflows that could help with the currency stabilization.
Well, it's getting tons of inflows now, lots of tourism. The Nikkei up 2%, at the close today. We are higher this year, Lisa, by 24.25% on the Nikkei.
Yeah, I do wonder how much tourism is giving them a boom economically. I just know from some discussions.
I'm not sure how happy the Japanese are.
No.
With that boom, and these cities becoming even crowded.
Yeah, have you seen some of the angry messages?
Yeah,
Please stay out. Stop photographing us living our lives.
They don't want dollar yen at 161 either. Wei Li of BlackRock. Wei, congratulations on a new outlook. Thank you very much for joining us. The third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance. Up next.
The growth has definitely turned a little bit the last month. And I think the key part of that is it's just gotten more broad.
We're not seeing a weakening. We're not seeing a contraction. But this is what drives the economy, and we are seeing a deceleration.
What we're seeing is signs that the consumer is slowing down.
When you look at last quarter's GDP, a little bit lower, a little bit below trend, I think this means we are going to start to see more slowing in GDP and overall spending.
There are key pockets of weakness. This is a lopsided economy.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Live from New York City, the third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now with quite a day ahead. In many ways, the week begins a little bit later this morning. At 10 a.m. Eastern Time, you will hear from Chairman Powell going in front of the Senate Banking Committee, in front of the House Financial Services Committee tomorrow on Capitol Hill. And then at the same time, two screens up at the same time, I think, a little bit later this morning, Chairman Powell on one. On the other one, Lisa, Secretary Yellen testifying to the House.
So there are two issues. Will Fed Chair Jay Powell set up a September rate cut? That is essentially what a lot of people are looking for in terms of his rhetoric and whether he puts a bigger emphasis on some of the weakening in the economic data. And then there's a real question about how politics affects this. He's not going to say that. Maybe we're going to hear a little bit from Janet Yellen about some of the political ramifications of some of the issues that we've heard with Joe Biden, with NATO, and a question around just how strong of a leadership the U.S. can have.
And of course, as well, she'll probably be asked about the deficit, but most entirely, she will be asked by the Republican side of the aisle about Joe Biden's health. This is going to be very political for Secretary Yellen, even though she's supposed to be talking about international finance. Andrew Hollenhorst, though, when it comes to the other side of the split screen, he's saying Chair Powell will likely sound incrementally more dovish in congressional testimony this morning after the unemployment rate rose to 4.1% last week. Is this the moment potentially he takes to really set up September?
With good reason. I want to understand how he's going to characterize the unemployment rate. Will he lean on how much it's moved, how much higher it is, the fact that it's going to be above potentially where they forecast it to be by year end? Or will he say that on a historical basis it's still very low? Because we kind of know what he thinks already about the payrolls number, because he alluded to this in the news conference. He basically said, to some extent, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he thinks perhaps that's overstating the real strength and the gains that we're seeing in the general economy. And then we saw that backed up by the number on Friday anyway, when we saw the revisions to the previous 2 months. So really, for me, it's less about the headline number on payrolls and much more about what he thinks about what is happening with unemployment.
Whether he views this as a window to make an adjustment and whether you start to see a shift in the rhetoric. You were pointing earlier to what he said last week, John, when he was talking about how they have time. Does he see that they have less time now at a time when you basically are having a growing number of Wall Street analysts coming out and saying, actually, you know what, this might be the window that they have to really cut rates before it really becomes a pernicious increase in unemployment?
You can see the obvious sequence of things right now, right? You sort of tee it up a little bit today, you talk about it more in July, you go to Jackson Hole, really lay out your plans, and then you deliver it in September. Is that too cute? Do you think we're being too cute about the path here? Do they have to lay things out that clearly for everyone and give you advance notice over the course of 2-3 months?
No, they don't. And this is the issue, is that they don't from any economic perspective. But on a political perspective, there is this question that Peter Tchir was talking about. If they aren't a little cute about this, where they can basically forecast it now, does it basically set, as he was saying, social media spinning? I mean, basically, does this end up jeopardizing credibility of the Federal Reserve because of the timing if there is some sort of market response and people say, oh, they're just trying to juice the markets ahead of the election?
Well, let's talk about the markets, not the juice part ahead of the election, but the broader part of where we are right now. Equity futures on the S&P 500 positive by 0.2%. Yields up by 2 basis points on a 10-year, 429.59. And in foreign exchange, the euro just a little bit negative here, softer by 0.1%, 108.14. I wonder for the audience out there what you think the biggest market moving event might be, whether it will be the testimony from Chairman Powell later this week or whether it will be the news conference with the president on Thursday. Which one will it be?
I'm obviously looking at the news conference. I think it's really important. This is going to be his moment to potentially quell those concerns. He tried to do it yesterday. I don't think it worked. And yesterday he really was hammering on all cylinders, firing on all cylinders. It was a letter to congressional Democrats. It was an appearance on TV. It was a phone call with donors. And then it was an evening Zoom with the Congressional Black Caucus. And still today you have people. I mean, we just heard from a donor who said behind the scenes, that number we know of is 9 congressional Democrats that are saying he needs to step aside. The number is obviously much bigger. And how bigger is it? And can Thursday really mean the dams are breaking for real?
We know the mood the president's in. came out swinging yesterday, some choice comments on party officials. The party has spoken. The Dem nominee is me. On donors, I don't care what the millionaires think. We know what mood he's in. The mood of the press is really interesting. And I think you've got an example of that yesterday in that news conference. And I think you're going to see another example of it again on Thursday. We had a conversation earlier this week about career risk of analysts, OK? We have to talk about career risks of journalists, people who've been in that room every single day, very close to this White House, who haven't reported on this. And I know some people have done a good job. I think of Axios, the Wall Street Journal, select names of this institution as well, of course. There are other companies, other institutions that have ignored this for months. And they're the ones that are really fired up right now because they don't want to be the individual that didn't cover this if things get a whole lot worse. And it's the mood of them that I think you got an example of yesterday that you're going to see again on Thursday.
You have people who feel like they have been betrayed, whether it's a cover-up, whether it's this idea that their indication was they should just sort of be quiet about this. It wasn't that serious when it became very serious at the debate. And that sense of betrayal you're seeing sort of play out in real time.
You're going to see it again on Thursday. Coming up this hour, you might see it this hour too, with Emily Roland of Jan Hancock, as she talks about stocks hitting fresh record highs. You really won't. Helane Becker of TD Cowen as holiday air travel surpasses records, and Lauren Goodwin of New York Life ahead of Chairman Powell's testimony a little bit later. We begin with our top story. Stocks hitting the 35th record high of the year so far. But Emily Roland of John Hancock remaining cautious, saying this: if the US economy had a relationship status, it would be it's complicated. Amidst weaker economic readings, we came back to the bad news is good news regime for markets, with everything rallying on these releases. It has been a good run, but bad news is likely to start to mean bad news for markets soon. Emily is with us right now for more. Emily, just walk us through that. I understand the regime we're in at the moment. Bad news, good news. Saw it in the market, saw it in the price last week. Why do you think that's going to change sometime soon?
Well, look, you just look at those June business surveys. They showed vastly different trends for the U.S. economy. The ISM survey on both the manufacturing and services side falling below 50. And meanwhile, you have the S&P version that showed that we're in an expansionary territory, both, again, on manufacturing and services. Then you look at things like the jobs report, which you all have been referencing this morning. You saw great on the surface, 206,000 new jobs added, but underneath the surface, massive revisions to the tune of 111,000, and then the unemployment rate jumping to above 4.1%. So the economic data right now are about as clear as mud, but we do see a broad decelerating trend happening, and that's something that investors need to be aware of. Right now, we're celebrating the idea that we're reviving hopes of rate cuts. Now bond markets pricing in 2 cuts for this year, but at some point the Fed's going to be cutting not on a preemptive basis, but because growth is decelerating meaningfully and the labor market is deteriorating.
So, Emily, what are you selling and what are you buying? I mean, is this basically sell the S&P, buy long bonds?
Not necessarily. We continue to see momentum driving markets. We've seen this kind of combination of quality and momentum really taking center stage. We've been overweight quality, overweight U.S. tech stocks, and that's really been important. So I wouldn't say we're overly bearish in this stage. It's funny. I listen to you guys every morning, and it just feels like there's very few bulls out there. Everybody that comes on has kind of a bearish tilt to them. And bear markets don't really start that way. They usually start with a lot of optimism. So we're really not seeing that. There's also a ton of cash on the sidelines right now. Money market assets are sitting at $6 trillion. There's $23 trillion in bank accounts. There's still a lot of dry powder here to keep this market going. We just want to think about participating, but getting a little bit more defensive. In addition to those higher quality options, we're looking at defensive areas like utility stocks. We want to lean into quality at a reasonable price, looking at the value side for stocks and sectors that are trading on sale, areas like healthcare, U.S. mid-cap equities, industrials, which we're seeing as an opportunity here. But of course, that a lot of that's in the price on the equity side, trading at 21 times forward earnings. Bonds are not sniffing this out yet. We started the year at 388 on the 10-year Treasury, sitting at about 430 right now. There is a really nice opportunity here to look at getting paid income as we wait for this potential contraction in economic activity to play out.
We've been talking all morning about sort of the push-pull between weak economic data and the political backdrop that's been whipsawing bonds. And I want to go there. You think it's a good opportunity to buy long-term bonds at a time where there's a backup and you do have this potential slowdown. How much do political concerns weigh on this, whether it's trade policy, whether it's the deficit?
Yeah, we actually think it's noise on the political side. We tend to underweight political analysis and making cross-asset decisions. It's really difficult to do. We have made mistakes trying to do it in the past, and we found that looking at the economic backdrop, looking at fundamental trends has been far more relevant to portfolios. So to your point, as we've seen these backup in bond yields reflecting some of this political concern and we've seen it globally, we would be looking at those backups opportunistically to start leaning into high quality bonds and again, getting paid that income. We do think inflation's decelerating. We'll obviously find out more this week, but we're looking at things like average hourly earnings falling, used car prices are falling. The shelter component is likely to come down as the housing market starts to cool off a little bit here. All of those things mean that inflation, which was bonds' worst enemy, we think is going to start to be our friend here as we approach the back half of this year.
Emily, are you saying this, it's complicated in terms of the U.S. economy, Fed relationship status, is not, it's complicated plus because of the politics surrounding it? You saying that just, you have to look through it?
Not necessarily that you have to look through it, but we're at this point right now where, look, economic data is not bad. And certainly it's great in the U.S. versus the rest of the world on a relative basis. You look at things like initial claims, which to us is one of the best, most timely macro indicators. Yes, they're perking up and a lot's been made of that, but we're still in this range of 200,000 to 260,000 that we've been over the past couple of years here. So really not all that bad. Again, we're still adding jobs. We're looking at an environment in which some of the surveys tell us that economic growth is in expansionary territory. So we just want to be mindful here because there are cracks underneath the surface if you look really closely at the data. And we want to be prepared for an environment where we do see slower economic growth. Look, inflation coming down, it feels great right now. There's nothing better than waking up to the smell of disinflation in the morning. And we'll see if that happens with this latest CPI report, but it's not great for corporate revenues. So as we see corporate profits come down amidst that slowing inflation environment, the cost of capital is still elevated right now. The Fed hasn't cut yet. That means there's likely to be margin compression. And as companies deal with defending those margins, they want to stay profitable. They have to cut costs. Typically, the biggest cost most companies have is labor. So we are looking at the sequence of events, which should ultimately result in the unemployment rate rising. And again, that's an environment where you will get paid owning higher quality bonds.
Emily, thank you. We've got to leave it there. Emily Roland of John Hancock looking ahead to the smell of disinflation on Thursday morning. Looking for CPI, headline CPI to come in at 3.1% year over year. Lisa, down from 3.3.
There's nothing better than waking up to the smell of disinflation with, as you mentioned, French oats. I mean, honestly, this to me is
sort of a Brexit theme in financial markets. We're a sad bunch, aren't we?
I think so. And then there, of course, we've got Peter Tchir saying, I don't even know what reality is anymore because everything gets spun by social media.
So let's talk about the deficit.
Look, okay, you don't have to go there again. I know. But it was relevant at the moment, and he actually cares about it. So let's park that for a second. I am curious, though, just how much people are looking through some of this noise. And we heard that now from two people on the show this morning, Kelsey, Berro, and now from Emily Roland, this idea that this backup in yield is a buying opportunity. Look through everything and just look to the idea that you're getting the smell of disinflation.
Is it noise or is it news? And that's part of the challenge right now. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Commercial Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Donald Trump has said that he hasn't decided yet who will be his vice presidential pick. Speaking to Fox's Sean Hannity, he plans to make an announcement in the coming week. The former president said his running mate would be, quote, a person that can do a fantastic job as president, as well as somebody that helps you get elected, and there's nothing wrong with that. Trump said Senators J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum were all under consideration. The lawyer representing Archegos founder Bill Hwang has made his final pitch to a jury. Hwang was accused of being behind a scheme that artificially jacked up stock prices, eventually costing Wall Street banks $10 billion. Hwang's lawyer repeatedly said that the case, quote, makes no sense, and that Archegos experienced a black swan event. The jury's verdict will bring an end to a trial that's lasted 8 weeks and force many to revisit what led to that implosion of Archegos in 2021. Hamad International Airport in Qatar takes the top spot in this year's Air Health Survey of the world's best airports. The company creates the rankings partially based on customer feedback, quality of food, and shopping options at 239 airports globally. Punctual arrivals and departures represent 60% of each airport score. Rounding out the top three were Cape Town International Airport in South Africa and Chubu Centrar International Airport in Japan. Just one U.S. airport cracked the top 10, and that was Salt Lake City International Airport, which opened in 2020. And that's your brief. John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Politics is the gift that keeps giving. It writes its own jokes. You ask the former president what he wants to see in a running mate, a person that can do a fantastic job as president, somebody that helps you get elected. That's it. That's the only description we've got. That's what we're basing on all this speculation, like who it's going to be in the next week. Someone that helps you get elected.
Right. What is that? And that's going to be the key question.
Baseline.
Yeah, basically. I mean, but at what point is that going to change depending on what happens on the other side?
Well, that's the key point. That is the key point for the next week or so. Up next on this programme, the morning calls and Helane Becker of TD Cowen as summer travel demand continues to skyrocket. That conversation up next from New York. This is Bloomberg. Counting it down to the opening bell of 1 hour and 12 minutes away. Equity futures on the S&P 500 in the green and just about positive by 0.2%. Yields are higher on bonds by 2 basis points. The 10-year 429.78. Time now for some morning calls. First up, Piper Sandler upgrading Bank of America to neutral. The analysts no longer seeing a reason for the bank to underperform, expecting net interest income to rise to a stronger level. But the analyst still prefers its peers, Citi and JPMorgan. Next up, Wolf Research downgrading Paramount to underperform on the back of the Skydance takeover deal. The analyst saying that the investment debate is now simplified to whether the media giant can invest profitably in direct-to-consumer products. And finally, Wells Fargo raising its price target on Airbnb to 129, maintaining an underweight rating. The firm highlighting near-term momentum for reservations, but it's less optimistic about margin pressures into next year. That stock is just about positive, 0.1%. Sticking with travel, the TSA screening more than 3 million people on Sunday. Rounding out the July 4th holiday weekend, it's the first time that many passengers have been screened in a single day in the agency's history. 8 of the 10 busiest screening days have come this year as travel demand tops pre-pandemic levels. To discuss this and a whole lot more, Helane Becker of TD Cowen joins us. Helane, let's talk about this. Super busy weekend at a time when Boeing is struggling to build planes and United Airlines, at least their jets, are struggling to hold on to the wheels. Helane, I'm just wondering, are things too busy?
Yeah, thanks for the question, John. Yeah, I mean, we've never seen these kind of travel levels before. The system has proven that it really is having a hard time handling it, especially when there's bad weather and we have huge delays and so on. It just cascades down through the entire network. And so you're seeing bigger planes in general rather than more service because there's only so much that can be done. And we don't often, you and me and Lisa and the team, we always talk about airline traffic. We don't talk about what's happening at the airports. And the airports are having their own issues with lack of parking, with the lack of, in some cases, lack of food options and lack of seating, especially at some of the older airports where people, are asked to come early. And then they have to wait. There's no charging stations in a lot of older airports. The charging stations in newer airports don't work. So there's this whole ecosystem that was built around a smaller level of population that travels. And now we're seeing so many people travel on a regular basis. To your point, 8 of the 10 busiest days have been this year, and most of them have been in the last 6 weeks.
So do you think that, Helane, this is introducing a problem that is just would have been the case even pre-pandemic, or do you think that it's been exacerbated to a big degree because the personnel just isn't there after a lot of the layoffs in 2020, in 2021 that have left a lot of senior people no longer in the workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. I think this level of travel was coming anyway, because you have an aging population and you have a lot of people who have more time to travel, and they're doing so, right? They're doing a lot of bucket list trips and so on. So you're seeing this huge increase in international travel. For younger people, they got used to traveling with their parents and they want to continue to travel with their own families. So you're seeing a lot of that. But to your point, we were expecting those kind of travel numbers maybe a little bit later in the decade, not so much now. And also all of those people who left, whether they were furloughed or they chose early retirement or they chose other careers, in the 2020 to let's say 21, mid 2022 timeframe, the people who have come in to replace them are less experienced. The FAA says we're short about 3,000 air traffic controllers. Congress approved the new budget, which allows for the hiring of more. It also allows a path for those who have been air traffic controllers in the military to come into the network without going through the entire FAA training academy. So there is a way to increase that. But at the busiest airports, the pay scales are still relatively low. So people don't want to do that career. They don't want that job because they have to live within, I think, an hour and a half of their base. It's very expensive to live in the New York area. It's very expensive to live in Chicago area, San Francisco. And so people don't want those jobs. And the result is that we have this limitation on how much capacity can grow, which is should eventually be good for airlines because they should make more money. But for travelers, it means they have to pay more for airline tickets.
Can we talk about what happened yesterday with United, the most recent mishap when it comes to losing its wheel? And John asked the question earlier that was the right one. Do you think this is a United issue or do you think this is a Boeing issue?
I think it's an issue. I think it's more of a supply chain issue. And I think in this case, it was probably a United issue, not a Boeing issue. Aircraft come out of maintenance. They have to be double checked, triple checked before they go back on the line. This was a case of a wheel falling off. This is not obviously the first time United has had an issue. I don't want to disparage them because they're a safe airline. I fly them a lot. You guys probably fly them a fair amount being in the New York area. So I don't want to say negative things about them, but yeah, I mean, every airline can be good or bad on any given day, and they're just having this issue. And for them, this was a 757, I think, that you're talking about. And that's an older plane that's been around for a very long time with a really good safety record.
Helane, what do you like right now in the airline sector? Everyone seems to love Delta. Terminal 4 is a mess, just to throw that out again. Helane, what do you like in the airline sector right now?
Well, Delta actually was our top pick for 2024, so getting thrown under the bus there. But yeah, I think from a balance sheet perspective, from a traffic perspective, growth, opportunity, their big advantage is that only pilots are unionized on property. Everybody else is not union, so they have the ability to make adjustments without going through an entire big process. Unlike the other airlines, if they want to make adjustments, they have to go through the unions. So Delta was our top pick for 2024. I think it still continues to be. We also have buys on United and Alaska Air as other ideas. Copa. I've talked to you guys a lot about Copa in the past. It's one of our favorite names in the mid-cap airline sector. So I think those would be our top 4 or 5.
Helane, thanks for jumping on for us. Appreciate it. Helane Becker there of TD Cowen. Looking ahead to Deutsche reporting later this week. Someone around this table flew Deutsche over the weekend, right, and had some problems at Terminal 4 coming back from the airport.
Is that right?
Yeah, and deeply personal.
Does somebody want to talk about said problems?
You were part of the record, though, the TSA screening record.
I'm very proud to be part of the record. I don't know how pleased I am to be part of that Terminal 4 mess, honestly.
But did you get there on time?
Did I get to my destination on time? Oh, yeah, sure.
And did you get back on time?
No, delayed.
Okay.
Technical issue.
All right.
Delayed by about an hour, I think.
Maybe they wanted to make sure the wheel didn't fall off.
And then delayed trying to get, transport back from Terminal 4.
Yeah, well, that's not fair.
Equity futures on the S&P 500 positive here by 0.1%, elevated across the board on the Nasdaq as well by 0.25%, the 35th all-time high of the year at the close yesterday. The fate of today's price action in the hands of one man, Chairman Powell, and maybe some other stuff too. Get to the bond market. The 2-year, 10-year, 30-year looks like this. The 2-year 463.89, yields up by a single basis point. On the 10-year, up by 2 to 429.59. We've talked a lot about the debt issuance coming up a little bit later. We get $58 billion of 3-year notes, Lisa. Then we get 10s, and the day after that, we get 30s.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand why we suddenly saw a real tick up in yields and why we saw the Russell 2000 go negative, considering the fact that there isn't really anything out there that I can particularly key in. I don't think it is the auction, since we've known about that for a long time. I do wonder whether you start to see political risk creep into the appetite for the longer duration bonds. We heard that from Peter Tchir. We heard that also on the flip side from the likes of Kelsey, Berro, who say use any of those dips to buy. Do we see that buying activity on a day like today, tomorrow, or Thursday?
Ian Lincoln of BMO said exactly the same thing about this bond market. Want to watch a little bit later. I want to finish on foreign exchange, take a quick sneak peek at what's happening with the euro. Just a quick one, because not much. Euro dollar 108.16. We're negative by not even a tenth of 1%. Under surveillance this morning, the White House firing back at reports about President Biden's health, including a New York Times story citing multiple visits by neurologists specializing in Parkinson's disease. Biden's doctor releasing a statement last night saying the specialist had only conducted routine exams.
And what they're saying is that the specialist came in also to treat other members of the White House campus, including military members who serve there. The issue is, why were they so delayed on this? You saw that exchange between Karine Jean-Pierre and some of the journalists, and then it was only late last evening that the physician came out with a note. All of this feels like the White House is on the back foot. They're on the back foot on trying to shore up donors and trying to get out to congressional Democrats, individuals who are questioning whether this president needs to step aside, and also on the back foot on quelling these concerns about whether or not the president was treated or consulted with a Parkinson's expert.
I can tell you the tone of that briefing, the appetizer for what's still to come on Thursday. That's the main course.
How much are you going to end up getting? A pretty aggressive press corps. I'm wondering, when you talk about the relationship to markets, what the playbook is if Biden is or isn't the Democratic nominee. If there is a shift in the belief whether he could actually maintain that, how much does the market trade change? Do we have a sense of that at a time where maybe it's noise, call it noise, but the noise happens. And so at some point, some people are going to be making bets on this.
Didn't we get a taste of that 2 Fridays ago when we started to price in a Donald Trump presidency a little bit more?
If there were a candidate, though, who had a better chance of winning versus Donald Trump, what would the trade be at that point? I just wonder when people start to actually get their head around this. There's one thing when you say Joe Biden looks like a weak candidate and he's going to remain in. That's the Trump trade. What happens if there's another candidate that is a stronger competitor with Donald Trump who would like to see this unfold with Joe Biden being the candidate?
We'd have to get to know the candidate, wouldn't we? If it's Kamala Harris, I wonder how much distance there is, how much daylight there is between the VP and the president at the moment on the same ticket.
It's a great question. I would like to see some notes on that.
I'm sure you would. Write them, I think is what Lisa's saying. Let's talk about Nike. Bringing back a veteran executive to try to fix its sales slump. Tom Petty is set to return as vice president of Marketplace Partners. The sportswear giant is trying to rebuild its relationship with retailers like Foot Locker after pulling products in favor of its own stores and e-commerce operations.
This is actually a really interesting story. During the pandemic, a lot of the big brands, Nike in particular, said, we don't need you. Foot Locker, we don't need you. Loman's doesn't exist anymore, but any other store that distributes some of these things. There's this question of, we can go direct to the consumer and we don't have to lose profits in the transaction. Now they're realizing that didn't work. They're trying to lure them back. So they're bringing back a previous executive. I find this quite interesting. How much are they going to bring those relationships back into the fold when they realize that those physical distribution centers are actually incredibly important?
What's old is new. They're bringing back an individual who is in retirement, but likely, to your point, he probably has these relationships that they need to, what the sounds of it, really shore up in a quick way.
Have they got a distribution problem or a design problem?
It's a great question.
I can speak from my own personal perspective on this.
We know what you buy. You've told us all.
Sure. I know where to get Nike from. I don't think they've got a distribution problem. I think they've got a design problem.
Or a relevancy to the people who buy sneakers, which are runners and athletic endeavors. I mean, I do wonder how much this is just basically getting away from some of the bread and butter and counting on Air Jordans to carry them through, and then Air Jordans lose some of their luster, and suddenly the reselling trade doesn't work in the same kind of way, et cetera. And you lose some of the glass. Look, I have a personal relationship with this.
I know, which is why I'm smiling.
I know, you're laughing at me, but...
On the side, Lisa trades Jordans.
No, I do not trade Jordans, but at a time that was cool for the kids to do that. It's not anymore.
OK, let's move on from this story. You can't keep it together. That's the latest on Nike. The latest this morning for the market, it's all about this. All eyes on Capitol Hill at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Fed Chair Jay Powell beginning his two-day congressional testimony in front of the Senate Banking Committee. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking to House Financial Services on the same day at the same time. This all ahead of more inflation data this week, including CPI and PPI. With us around the table, waiting patiently and holding it together, is Lauren Goodwin in New York Live, alongside Brett Ryan at Deutsche Bank. To the both of you, thanks for being with us. Lauren, I want to start with you. What are you expecting to hear from Chairman Powell in about 90 minutes' time?
I'm not expecting to hear a whole heck of a lot. I think that he's going to toe the line, just do some basic explaining of where the economy's been, where inflation has been. I don't think we're going to get a clear monetary policy signal from him. However, I do believe that we've been getting a clear monetary policy signal from the data. We all know that the Fed cares about price stability, full employment. What we've been seeing, what we've been looking for in terms of signaling a next rate cut are things like stable inflation expectations, inflation moving lower, and unemployment rate breaking 4%. These are factors that have all started to turn in the last couple of months. I think the Fed will want to see one more month confirming that turn, but I expect September's on the table for a first rate cut.
Last week, Chairman Powell said the labour market's strong, and that gives them time. That's a reason to wait. Do you share that view, that analysis?
The labour market is strong. But the real reason why the Fed has the opportunity to wait is because financial conditions in the market have been easy, because stocks have been well behaved, credit spreads have been well behaved. And the reality for the job market is that in 9 out of the last 10 recessions, the economy was adding jobs until we were already there. And so the labor market tells us all kinds of things about where the economy has been, not where we're going. And so I believe that that financial condition easiness, it allows the Fed to be patient, but it could turn on a dime.
Lauren, it's fascinating to me, and Brett, I'd love you to weigh in on this idea that it seems to be getting clearer and clearer where the economy is going for a growing number of at least our guests. Today, a number of people have come on and said, if you look at just the unemployment rate, if you look at inflation, the signals are clear. Do you agree?
Well, I think from the chair's perspective, the growth data and the latest labor market data would say that they're more confident that they're restrictive, right? We came from a 3.5% growth in the back half of last year. We're now tracking about 1.5, a little bit over 1.5 for the first half of this year. We're seeing payroll growth slow, but I think to the point of what Powell's going to be talking about, what we saw in Central last week was him emphasizing all of the dovish points. This is a strong labor market, not because hiring is strong, but because layoffs and discharges are low. And so the question is, how long is that going to last? With inflation, though, I think the message has been clear. We need to see more better prints. This week's data should show a bit of a rebound. The weakness in last month's CPI report was really all due to airfares as well as motor vehicle insurance. So, they need to see rents starting to move back down to get sustainably to 2%. So they're not there yet. But that said, Powell had said, an unexpected slowing of the labor market would be a reason to move earlier. So, our base case remains that December is going to be the first cut. But the door is definitely wide open, to Lauren's point, on September.
Brett, what would you have to hear in today and tomorrow's testimony from Jay Powell to change your call to be September from December?
So what was interesting in what he phrased, how he phrased the recent inflation data at Central last week was that he compared the May, April, and prints to the first quarter of the year. And he said, May was a step in the right direction. April was not as good, but still better than Q1. But April was actually worse than the February print. And to me, it sounded like, okay, for Powell's starting point for how many good prints we need to see, April was sort of his starting point. April, May, So if you're thinking to yourself, okay, how many more prints do they need to see? 3, 4. It seemed from the way Powell phrased it, which was a little awkward, but deliberate, that his starting point was the April print. And so maybe, that to me speaks to he really wants to get a cut on the board soon. It just comes down to whether the inflation data give it to him, and he has a committee that goes along with it.
Do you think the election matters? Do you think that Canada matters and that date in November circled in red?
Right. So I think the election matters in the sense that one of the big unknowns here is the fiscal outlook. Now, arguably, from a deficit standpoint, it's going to be the same. But when you have extreme differences in terms of policies such as tariffs, inflationary, and then, I think that could cause a little bit of caution because you really don't know how that's going to shake out. You can get a sweep one way or the other, and the fiscal outlook could change in a more inflationary direction. So that's another reason to kind of, stay the course for now, unless you're forced to. Don't give up the policy space. By the way, that you've gotten to over 5% yields, which nobody thought was possible 5 years ago. Wait as long as you can. Obviously, you don't want to wait too long, as Powell's emphasized, and there are those little warning signs there.
But if they're trying to potentially look apolitical, you wouldn't want to cut right before the election, which would be September. And if April you think is maybe his starting point, why aren't more people talking about July then?
Yeah, they haven't been. I mean, it'd be a lot to signal right now, and I don't think he has a committee that's willing to go there just yet. But to your point about September, without a strong labor market story, cutting on an inflation story alone, why give the appearance, even if there isn't? Certainly the Fed is not political. They're going to do what's right for them, but what's right for the economy. But at the same time, I think it's going to take either a sharply slowing growth story or an unexpected, as Powell talked about, an unexpected, drawdown in the labor market.
One thing we've discussed on this programme repeatedly is that not all cuts are created equally. There's two very different kinds of rate cuts. One is a fine-tuning off the back of some disinflation with a positive economic backdrop. The other is a labour market that's breaking and something they have to respond to and really put the emphasis on the other side of their dual mandate. Lauren, you've said repeatedly that this market can thrive up and until when this labour market really starts to crack. And a question we've been asking on this programme is how close we are to that danger zone, with unemployment through 4 and claims starting to creep a little bit higher. Do you sit here and say that on a historical basis these are still very, very low levels, or do you look at the change, the rate of change and the time we've had that change in, and start to say we're getting close to that danger zone?
For the market signal, you look at where we've been most recently. The reality, from my perspective, that any impending slowdown or even recession is likely to be mild is sort of besides the point when it comes to a market transition. And so what we're looking for market concern about a turnaround in the labor market are things like the SOM rule. Right now, we would need to see 4.23% instead of the 4.1 where we are. Again, or jobless claims moving higher considerably. Neither of these things have been really moving in that direction so far. And so for investors that can be tactical, this is a market that we still see as fairly constructive until those labor market indicators or earnings expectations really start to turn the corner. We believe the equity market rally can continue to trudge higher.
This is sort of the confusion with the way that the market has rallied. But it hasn't been all names, right? It's been a number of names that have kind of led the charge in a pretty significant way. Isn't this market already positioned for some sort of significant slowdown? Isn't that the base case of what we're seeing in the Russell 2000 and the equal weight S&P?
I challenge that position. I'm sympathetic to the position, but I challenge that position a bit because we really haven't seen more than a couple of days of pullback over the course of this market. And so while there is a divergence, not just in particular equity names and sectors, but also in the health of the consumer, really depends where you sit on the income spectrum. We're still looking at a corporate environment overall, a consumer environment overall that are relatively healthy. And in order to see a true reset in investor expectations, we typically need to see an equity market revaluation of about 20%. And in the names that haven't been trudging higher, we haven't seen a revaluation of anywhere near that level. And so I anticipate that until economic activity really shows signs of slowdown, we haven't seen that reset yet.
Get a taste of everything. CPI on Thursday, and we get the earnings kicking off on Friday. Bank earnings just around the corner. Lauren Goodwin of New York Life, Brett Ryan of Deutsche Bank. To the two of you, thanks for being with us. Massive week ahead. Kicks off with Chairman Powell a little bit later this morning, testifying in front of the Senate Banking Committee at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. A quick check on BP shares in London, falling by 4 1/3% after warning of weaker oil refining and write-downs. BP sees significantly lower refining margins and says it will take up to $2 billion in impairments in the second quarter. The figure includes charges related to scaling back refining operations in Germany due to high costs and declining fuel demand. Pershing Square USA has launched a roadshow for the initial public offering of its common shares. The hedge fund management company is expected to list its IPO at $50 per share, and it's seeking to raise $25 from the listing. That could make it the largest fund of its kind in the U.S. Pershing Square will apply to list on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol PSUS. And Aramco is looking to raise at least $3 billion from its first bond sale in 3 years. That, according to people familiar with the plan. Meetings with fixed income investors are expected to start today. The offering, debt with 10, 30, and 40-year maturities. The final size could be larger depending on investor demand. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Danny, thanks for this morning. Appreciate it. Up next on the program, setting you up for the day ahead. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance live from New York City. This is Bloomberg. So a couple of times this morning, Danny's joined the program and she's broken down this list of the top airports in the world. Is that right?
Yeah.
Top airports in the world? Top 10?
Yeah.
Where is JFK on that list?
You know, it's a good question. I can't seem to find it. It's not on there.
What's the worst airport on the planet?
It's in Tunisia.
Okay.
I've been to both of them, the top and the worst.
Yeah, well, all I
You've
can
been to that
say...
airport?
Yes.
Is it that bad?
Honestly, I don't really remember it being that bad.
Well, I guess it's a matter
They didn't have a lot of extras. All right, so you go to the airport in Doha, and there's everything. There's even Ralph Lauren coffee.
Okay.
There's not a lot of extras at the Tunis
It's
airport.
basically like a hangar. You walk through and you get
Fly
a plane.
in, fly out.
Okay, all right. That's all you need. That's all you need. All right. Equity futures on the S&P 500 positive by 0.1%. Going into the opening bell about 41 minutes away. Lisa's still looking at this list. I can see you doing it. Looking at the bond market, yields are higher by a single basis point. Focus, Bramo. 429.39 on the US 10-year. Counting you down to the opening bell. Here's the trading diary for the rest of this week. It is absolutely stacked. At 10 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll get Fed Chair Jay Powell beginning his two-day congressional testimony in front of the Senate. At the same time, you'll hear from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking before the House. Tomorrow, more Fed speak from Goolsbee, Bowman and Cook. On Thursday, US CPI plus another round of jobless claims. We'll also get Delta earnings too. On Friday, US PPI and UMich, plus JPMorgan, Wells Fargo, Citi, all kicking off big bank earnings. With us around the table, I'm pleased to say, is Michael McKee to get us ready for what we're about to hear in about 1 hour and 10 minutes. Michael McKee, what are you focused on?
Tempelhof, that was a bad airport.
That was a bad airport.
Now. That was a bad airport.
All right.
Okay. From Jay Powell.
What people want to actually talk about.
And by the way, JFK is 113th. But carry on.
That makes sense.
Jay Powell is probably not going to give us a whole lot today. There are two categories, or we could say three categories of issues for him. One is monetary policy. He's going to say the same things that he has said. We are committed to the 2% inflation target. We have more to do, and we will think about cutting rates before we get to 2, but when we feel there's confidence that it's going to continue going down. The second aspect is bank regulation. He got the last Humphrey Hawkins testimonies were almost completely taken up by bank regulation questions from both the Senate and the House. So we'll probably get a lot on that today. And then, tomorrow maybe more so with the House, but there are always some political questions. And I'm sure that however you wrap them up, it's either do you support Joe Biden or do you support Donald Trump? And he will say, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole.
There is this issue, and we've been talking about it all morning with all of the guests that we've had on surveillance, which is, will his tone be different this week than in Sintra, given the jobs report, given some of the data that indicates that unemployment is rising and inflation is coming down?
Well, you know, that's going to be the debate after it's over, was how dovish was he? Did he shade one way or another? But they have been talking about paying more attention to unemployment and the other half of their mandate in recent weeks, over the last couple of meetings even. So it wouldn't be new news. It's really what the market is looking for, is some sort of thing to hang their hat on in terms of when we get a rate cut. And probably he's somewhat constrained by the fact that the CPI comes out on Thursday when he's done talking. So why go out at the end of the plank and maybe fall off if you don't have to, if there's more data coming?
Representative Andy Barr said yesterday to reporters, though, that a September rate hike, quote, will not be perceived as apolitical. If Powell is thinking about potentially there is a cut before the election, doesn't he need to do some work today and tomorrow to make sure that he is preparing at least the political voices in D.C. for that to potentially happen?
I don't think he needs to do it today or tomorrow. He can make it clear that the Fed will do what it feels it needs to do when it feels it needs to do it, and that they are not influenced by politics. But I think when they get the problem is you can't say anything on Capitol Hill that doesn't go straight into the newspapers. And so he doesn't want to do that and let people start speculating, because you're going to get a lot of market volatility once the markets start to think that it's coming. But he does, remember, spend a lot of time talking to individual members of Congress, and that's the kind of thing that maybe if he trusts somebody, he can go off the record and he's not going to say we're going to do it, but say we're getting closer.
Can you just give me some insight on this? Because this morning we got the NFIB small business optimism coming in actually stronger than expected at the highest level this year. Why isn't this being talked about as sort of highlighting that this is still an economy that has quite a bit of steam behind it?
Oh, it depends on whom you're talking to. There are people on both sides on Wall Street. There are people who say that the economy is doing fine, and the Fed is sort of along with them, saying we don't need to move now because we're not in trouble. And then, of course, the doom crew has been saying we are about to go into recession 6 months ago. And so he's going to balance those two things. But the narrative, in part because it's a political year, too, is what's wrong. That tends to be the journalist view. I mean, you don't get a lot of stories on the front page saying everything is wine and roses.
10 a.m., what will you be watching? Chairman Powell or Secretary Yellen? If you had to pick one.
Oh, I'd be watching Chairman Powell because he can have a direct influence. What'll be interesting from Yellen is any talk about what their debt policy is going to be. We have auctions this week, and that's going to be important to a sector of the bond market. But the overall impression of the economy and the overall idea about what we do about interest rates will come from Jay Powell.
We know what Lisa's watching at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Mike McKee, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Coming up tomorrow, Brian Levitt of Invesco, Dan Skelly of Morgan Stanley, Lisa Coleman of JPMorgan, Steve Englander of Standard Chartered. That's your lineup for tomorrow. Just some final thoughts around the table going into Chairman Powell later this morning.
Buy the dip on political noise.
Yeah.
Which dip? And that, I think, is the most interesting aspect as people look to some of the disruptions in markets and what they think is noise and what they don't.
You did the week ahead, but honestly, we missed, I think, what is the biggest event, which is Biden and the need for him to perform Thursday evening. He needs to be like the Biden of early 2022, when he did that record, nearly 2-hour-long news conference and took questions from everyone in the room, things he wasn't even prepared for. He cannot just come out and take 2 to 4 questions. That's not going to cut it.
Will this be a news conference on NATO or a news conference on the president's health? What's this going to be a news conference on?
The questions will start with something about NATO and the U.S. looking strong, and how can we look strong if people are questioning your ability?
That's the week ahead. Look ahead for that on Thursday. All of that still to come this week. It kicks off with Chairman Powell a little bit later this morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, in front of the Senate, then in front of the House tomorrow. Then we get CPI data on Thursday morning. Then on Friday, we start to get earnings. We can talk about what's coming from the likes of JPMorgan, the likes of Citi, and look ahead to Goldman and Morgan Stanley into the next week as well.
That might actually be potentially the most market-moving event if they signal some sort of weakness, if people basically are looking for that.
That does it for us. Look out for our colleagues at the top of the hour, Shnali Bassa, Cody Gradford, Matt Miller, with Bloomberg Open Interest. That programme about 4 minutes away. From New York City, that does it for us. This was Bloomberg Surveillance.